Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The apartment smelled like artificial pine and old cigarette smoke, a combination that made my throat tight every time I walked through the door. My Uncle Garrett had left for his girlfriend's place in Toledo 2 days before Christmas, and I'd agreed to house sit because I had nowhere else to be. The arrangement suited us both. He got someone to watch his place, and I got to avoid the questions from my family about why I'd lost another job, why I'd broken up with another girlfriend, why I couldn't seem to get anything right. Cleveland in December felt like the city was slowly suffocating under gray wool. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had probably been nice in the 70s, back when the neighborhood still had grocery stores that weren't behind bulletproof glass. Now it just felt tired. The radiator clanked and hissed throughout the day, and the windows were so old that frost formed intricate patterns on the inside of the glass. I'd been doing fine for the first 2 days. I watched his cable, ate his frozen pizzas, and pretended I was the kind of person who could afford a 1-bedroom in a building with working heat. But by Christmas Eve, the loneliness had started to calcify in my chest. I could hear other apartments celebrating, muffled music, laughter that felt like it was happening in another dimension. I turned the TV up loud enough to drown it out, and worked my way through half a bottle of his cheap bourbon. Around midnight, I remembered that Garrett smoked. I'd quit 3 months ago, part of my latest attempt to get my life together, but sitting there in his living room with the artificial tree blinking its colored lights in the corner, I convinced myself that 1 cigarette wouldn't matter. Just one to take the edge off. It was Christmas Eve after all. Even Jesus probably would have given me a pass. The problem was that Garrett kept his cigarettes in his bedroom, and something about going in there at night felt wrong. I'd been avoiding the room during my stay, using the pull-out couch in the living room instead. The bedroom door had a way of hanging slightly ajar no matter how firmly I closed it, and the gap always seemed wider than it should be, like the doorframe itself was warped. I waited until 3 in the morning. I'm not sure why I waited that long. Maybe I was still arguing with myself about breaking my streak of sobriety from nicotine. Maybe some part of me knew I shouldn't go near that room. The bourbon had worn off enough that I was left with just the raw anxiety that had been my constant companion for the past 6 months. The feeling that something fundamental had broken inside me, and I didn't have the tools to fix it. The hallway felt longer than it should have been. Garrett had strung cheap garland along the walls, and in the dim light from the living room, it looked less festive and more like something botanical and invasive, creeping along the plaster. The pine scent was stronger here, almost aggressively sweet, making my eyes water. When I reached for the bedroom door handle, I noticed my hand was shaking. I told myself it was just the withdrawal, just my body remembering what it wanted. The metal was cold enough to hurt. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges didn't make a sound, which somehow felt worse than if they had creaked. The room beyond was darker than it should have been. Garrett's blackout curtains were drawn, but there should have been some light from the street, some ambient glow from the city. Instead, the darkness felt absolute, textured, like something I could reach out and touch. I fumbled for the light switch, but before my fingers found it, something moved. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was a displacement of air, a sense of mass suddenly present where nothing had been before. Something black and compact erupted from the shadow next to the doorframe, not emerging gradually, but launching itself with violent urgency. It had weight to it, substance. Not quite a shape I could define, but definitely there, definitely real, pushing against me with force enough to make me stumble backward. The impression I had was of a body without features, condensed darkness with intention behind it. For just a fraction of a second, I felt something that might have been fingers, cold, impossibly cold, brush against my forearm. Then I was moving backward without deciding to move, my body making decisions my brain was too slow to authorize. I don't remember turning around. I don't remember consciously choosing to run. But suddenly I was taking the stairs 3 at a time, my hand barely touching the railing. my feet hitting each step with a hollow percussion that echoed through the building. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no pursuit, no breathing. The silence following me down felt worse than any sound could have been. The pine smell vanished somewhere between the second and first floor, replaced by something else entirely. It took me a moment to identify it because it was so unexpected. Coal smoke. Not cigarettes, not the residual tobacco smell that clung to everything in Garrett's apartment. This was older, deeper. The smell of anthracite burned in an ancient furnace, heavy and mineral and faintly sulfuric. It coated the inside of my nose, worked its way down into my lungs. I burst through the ground floor door and into the small lobby, which was decorated with a drooping tinsel wreath and a dying poinsettia on the mail table. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, making everything look slightly unreal, like a stage set. I stood there, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and feeling ridiculous. What had I even seen? Anything. The room had been dark. I'd been drinking. I was stressed, sleep-deprived, coming off nicotine. The mind could play tricks. I knew that. I'd read enough about it during my last spiral into WebMD at 3 a.m, diagnosing myself with everything from brain tumors to early-onset schizophrenia. But I could still feel the cold on my forearm, still smell the coal smoke even though I was 2 floors away from it now. I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, sitting in one of the ancient chairs that probably dated back to the building's construction. The radiator there made sounds like someone tapping on metal pipes with a wrench, an irregular rhythm that kept me from falling asleep. Every time I thought about going back upstairs, my legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. When dawn finally started to gray the windows, I forced myself to climb back up. Each step felt like a small act of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. The stairwell smelled normal again, mildew and old carpet and someone's cooking from one of the first-floor apartments. Garrett's door was closed. I didn't remember closing it when I ran out, but maybe I had. Maybe my hands had worked on autopilot while my brain was busy processing terror. I stood in front of it for what might have been 5 minutes or 20, my key held out like a weapon. The apartment looked exactly as I'd left it. The TV was still on, playing some infomercial on mute. The tree still blinked its sad little lights. The bourbon bottle sat on the coffee table next to a glass with a finger of amber liquid still in the bottom. Everything mundane and normal and completely at odds with what I thought I'd experienced. I avoided looking down the hallway toward the bedroom for as long as I could, busying myself with making coffee, with checking my phone for messages I knew wouldn't be there, with anything that would delay the inevitable. When I finally worked up the nerve to walk down that hallway, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not pine anymore, not coal smoke, something else entirely. Burned hair, extinguished matches. The scent of something that had been on fire and was now decidedly not, leaving behind only the ghost of combustion. The bedroom door stood open the exact width I'd left it when I ran. The morning light came through a gap in the curtains, cutting across the floor in a blade of pale gray. Everything looked normal. The bed was made, same as it had been for days. Garrett's dresser held the usual debris of a middle-aged man's life. Loose change, receipts, a watch with a broken band. The cigarettes were in the top drawer where I'd remembered them being. The pack was half empty, the cellophane crinkled. I picked it up with fingers that still trembled slightly, telling myself I'd earned this one, that after the night I'd had, I deserved the chemical comfort of nicotine. That's when I saw the ashtray. Garrett kept it on top of the dresser, a heavy glass thing that had probably been stolen from a bar decades ago. I'd noticed it before. It was the kind of artifact that made me think about how long my uncle had been smoking, how many years of his life he'd spent poisoning himself. The ashtray had been empty every time I'd looked at it during my stay. Garrett had mentioned he was trying to quit too, said he hadn't smoked in the apartment for weeks, but now it was full. Not full exactly. There were no cigarette butts, no ash piled up from multiple smokes. Just a thin layer of fine gray powder coating the bottom, looking freshly deposited, and the ashtray was closed. Garrett had told me he kept it covered with a piece of cardboard to remind himself not to smoke. The cardboard was still there, held down by the weight of the glass rim. I lifted the cardboard. The ash underneath was cold, but somehow looked fresh, like it had been placed there recently rather than sitting for weeks or months. I touched it with one finger, expecting the dry grit of old combustion, but it felt different, damper, almost oily, leaving a smudge on my fingertip that I couldn't quite brush off. The cigarette pack in my other hand suddenly felt heavier than it should have been. I turned it over, and that's when my stomach dropped into free fall. There were marks on the cellophane. Fingerprints. But not mine. These were too large, the whorls too pronounced. And they weren't made of oil from skin or dirt from handling. They were made of soot. Black, sooty fingerprints, as if someone had been handling coal or charcoal, and then touched the package, touching it gently, almost caressingly. I dropped the pack. It hit the dresser with a soft sound and a few cigarettes spilled out. That's when I saw that one was missing. Not from the ones that had fallen out, from the pack itself. I'd counted them unconsciously when I first picked it up, the way anyone who's ever quit smoking counts them. Half a pack meant 10 cigarettes, but there were only 9 in the pack and 3 on the dresser. One had vanished, or been taken. My mind tried to create reasonable explanations. I'd miscounted. The pack had been opened before. Cigarettes had been smoked. I just hadn't paid attention. Maybe Garrett had smoked one before he left and I'd forgotten. Maybe I'd been so drunk last night that I'd come in here earlier and taken one myself and blacked out the memory. But none of those explanations accounted for the fingerprints. None of them accounted for the ash in the closed ashtray. And none of them accounted for what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, launching itself from the shadows at 3 in the morning. I backed out of the room slowly, the way you back away from a dog that might be rabid. The cigarettes stayed on the dresser. Whatever craving I'd had at 3 in the morning had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold certainty that something in this apartment was fundamentally wrong. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a haze. I tried to watch TV, tried to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about the ash, about the fingerprints, about the thing I'd seen. Every shadow in the apartment seemed denser than it should be. Every sound from the radiator felt like something moving in the walls. I called Garrett around noon. He didn't answer. I left a message that tried to sound casual, asking when he was coming back, saying something about needing to head out soon. My voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. As darkness fell early the way it does in December, I found myself standing in front of the bedroom again. The door had been closed all day. I'd shut it firmly after my discovery that morning, even dragged a chair from the kitchen to wedge under the handle. But now the chair was pushed aside, and the door stood open exactly as wide as it had been when I first ran from it. I hadn't touched the chair. I'd been in the living room all afternoon, never once going near the hallway. The apartment had been silent except for the TV and the endless percussion of the heating system. The streetlight outside cast just enough illumination through the living room window to make the hallway visible, a corridor of gray leading to the darker gray of the bedroom beyond. I could see the dresser from where I stood. I could see the ashtray. It was open again. The cardboard cover lay next to it. And even from this distance I could see more ash inside, more than there had been this morning. A small pile now, almost sculptural in its formation, like something had been carefully constructed from the remains of burning. And on the floor, leading from the bedroom toward where I stood, were marks. Not quite footprints. More like smudges, sooty impressions in the hardwood, barely visible but definitely there. They looked like someone had walked through ash and then tracked it through the apartment. But the pattern was wrong. The prints were too long, too narrow. The spacing between them too irregular, as if whatever made them had been moving in a way that human feet couldn't quite replicate. They led from the bedroom, down the hallway, and stopped just short of where I was standing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump hard enough to hit my shoulder against the doorframe. I fumbled it out, expecting, hoping for, a message from Garrett, something normal and mundane that would anchor me back in reality. But it wasn't Garrett. It was my mother, a text message that read only, "Merry Christmas, honey. Hope you're not alone." I looked back down the hallway. The ash prints on the floor seemed darker now, more defined. And beyond them, in the bedroom, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. The closet door, which I knew had been closed, now stood ajar. Just a crack. Just enough to let darkness seep through. Just enough that something could be watching me from inside. The radiator clanked, loud and sudden, and I heard myself make a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something breaking. The lights flickered once, and in that brief moment of dimness, I thought I saw something move in the bedroom, something that shifted position but made no sound, that rearranged itself in the darkness while the world stuttered. When the light steadied, everything looked the same. The ash prints, the open ashtray, the closet door hanging ajar. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in that moment of darkness, that whatever was in the bedroom had moved closer, had positioned itself with more intention. I grabbed my coat and my wallet and left. Didn't pack my bag, didn't turn off the TV, didn't even close the apartment door behind me. I just walked down those stairs and out into the Christmas evening, where the cold air felt clean and sharp and blessedly real. I walked for hours through empty streets, past houses with their Christmas lights blazing, past the few open convenience stores with their fluorescent brightness. I walked until my fingers went numb, and my breath came in clouds, and I couldn't feel my face anymore. Around midnight, I found myself at an all-night diner on the east side. The waitress looked at me with something between pity and concern, but she brought me coffee and pie and didn't ask questions. I sat in a booth by the window and watched the street, trying to convince myself that I'd overreacted, that I'd let stress and loneliness and too much bourbon create a narrative where none existed. But when I pulled out my wallet to pay, something fell onto the table. A cigarette. Not a whole one. About half of one, the end charred black as if it had been lit and then extinguished. The filter had marks on it, dark smudges that might have been from lips, or might have been from something else, something that had held it wrong, that had tried to use it the way a person would but couldn't quite manage the mechanics of smoking. It smelled like coal, like burning, like something returned. I left money on the table and walked back out into the night, the cigarette still sitting where it had fallen. Behind me, through the diner window, I could see the waitress picking it up, examining it, then dropping it in the trash with a disgusted expression. I never went back to Garrett's apartment. When he returned from Toledo, I told him I'd gotten food poisoning, had spent Christmas night in the hospital, couldn't finish house sitting. He seemed annoyed but not surprised, just another thing I'd failed to follow through on. He never mentioned finding anything unusual. Never talked about ash in the ashtray or prints on his floor. Never said anything about cigarettes missing or doors standing open that shouldn't have been. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe whatever it was had tidied up after itself. Maybe I really had imagined all of it. A stress-induced break, a psychotic episode, something that felt real but wasn't. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find cigarettes in my pockets that I don't remember buying. They're always half-smoked, always smell like coal, always have marks on the filter that look almost but not quite like they came from human lips. And I think about that thing in the darkness, that compact mass of intention that pushed me out of that room. I think about how it felt to be touched by something that shouldn't exist. I think about ash appearing in closed containers and footprints that track through apartments where nothing visible walks. I think about the possibility that some debts are never forgiven, that taking something that isn't yours, even something as small as a cigarette, might incur a cost that can't be paid all at once. That maybe the debt gets serviced in installments, in small hauntings, in reminders that some transactions happen outside the normal rules of exchange. I've quit smoking again. I've quit a lot of things. But I still find them sometimes. Those half-burned cigarettes, appearing in my coat pockets, in my car, once even on my pillow. Always returned, always used, always marked with prints that aren't quite right. And I wonder if whatever gave them back is finished with me yet. If the debt is paid, if the thing in the shadows is satisfied with the fear it's extracted, or if it's still there, still waiting, still counting every cigarette I might think about taking, that doesn't belong to me. I wonder if it will ever stop giving them back, or if this is just how things are now, forever, the exchange continuing, the balance never quite settling, the ash accumulating in places I can't see but can always smell, that mineral scent of coal smoke in the middle of the night, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Story 2. The woman in Atlantic City had shuffled the deck 3 times before laying out the cards. I'd wandered into her storefront on a whim, killing time before a conference dinner, half drunk on complimentary hotel wine, the tower, the hanged man, and finally, drowning at the bottom of the spread, the 10 of cups. Inverted, she'd said, which meant something about denial and emotional flooding. She'd touched the cards with fingers that left wet prints on the velvet cloth, even though it hadn't rained in days. That was 8 months ago. Now I stand on Pier 47 in Seattle, a city built on drowned forests and submerged tides, and I can still feel the dampness of her fingerprints on my wrist, where she'd grabbed me on my way out. The memory surfaces whenever I'm near water, which is ironic considering my entire career revolves around it. The contract seemed straightforward enough. Stress test the new emergency flood barriers before the Port Authority signed off on the installation. Night work, when maritime traffic thinned to almost nothing. I'd done 100 similar jobs, back when I could look at water without feeling my throat constrict. The pay was good. The timeline was tight. I needed the distraction. I arrived at 11, when the security guard still made his rounds. He'd waved me through with barely a glance at my credentials, more interested in his phone than my presence. The pier stretched ahead like a finger pointing into Elliott Bay, industrial lights casting long shadows that swayed with the rhythm of unseen currents below. Shipping containers stacked 4 high-formed canyon walls on either side of the main walkway, their corrugated surfaces sweating with condensation despite the dry forecast. The barriers themselves were simple, hydraulic gates that would rise from recessed channels if sensors detected abnormal water levels. My job was to verify the sensors worked, that the gates responded, that the emergency protocols functioned as designed. Mechanical certainty in an uncertain world. I'd always found comfort in that. I set up my equipment near the pier's end, where the gates formed a semicircle around the testing area. Laptop, sensor calibrators, radio for coordinating with the harbor master if needed. The water below looked black and thick, like something that had forgotten how to be liquid. Small waves slapped against the pilings with sounds that were almost conversational, whispered phrases I couldn't quite parse. The first anomaly occurred at 11:47 p.m. The evacuation siren mounted on the communications tower erupted without warning, its wail cutting through the industrial quiet like something dying. I jumped, knocking my calibrator into a puddle I didn't remember seeing. The sound continued for 30 seconds, the exact duration programmed for legitimate emergencies, then cut off so abruptly the silence felt violent. I checked my laptop. No logged activation. The system showed green across all indicators. According to every sensor and protocol, nothing had happened. I keyed my radio trying to raise the harbor master. Static answered, but not the clean white noise of an empty channel. This was different. Layered, almost rhythmic, with an underlying gurgle that made me think of words drowning before they could form. I adjusted the frequency. The static followed, adapting to each new channel like something learning to communicate. Then the lights began their performance. The overhead fixtures, industrial LEDs rated for years of continuous operation, started pulsing in sequence, dimming and brightening in waves that rolled down the pier toward me. But they weren't following any electrical pattern I recognized. They were following something else, something that corresponded to the water below. Each pulse matched a surge in the tide, even though the tide tables I'd memorized showed this should be a slack period, the pause between ebb and flow when the bay held its breath. I walked to the edge and looked down. The water line had climbed 6 inches up the piling since I'd arrived. Impossible. Not just unlikely, physically impossible given the moon phase and local conditions. Yet there it was, rising with each pulse of light, as if the two were connected by some circuit I couldn't perceive. That's when I saw the figure at the end of the breakwater. Distance makes specifics difficult, but certain impressions cut through uncertainty. The figure stood where no one should stand, on a section of breakwater I knew had collapsed 3 years ago during a winter storm. I'd read the incident report. 17 tons of concrete now rested on the bay floor, yet something stood exactly where that section once ended. The figure was soaked, not damp from sea spray or caught in rain, soaked in the way something emerges from full submersion, water streaming from clothes and hair and skin in quantities that seemed to defy gravity. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the puddle forming at its feet, spreading wider than physics should allow. It raised one arm, not a wave, not a gesture of greeting, a point, deliberate and specific, indicating something to my left. I followed the gesture and found myself looking at a section of pier infrastructure I'd walked past an hour ago: storage boxes, emergency equipment lockers, a maintenance ladder leading down to the lower deck where workers accessed the hydraulic systems. Except now, between two containers I distinctly remembered standing flush against each other, a gap had appeared, wide enough to slip through, and within that gap, barely visible in the stuttering light, another ladder descended, one I'd never seen in any of the pier schematics. My chest tightened. The sensation was familiar. The same pressure I'd felt in Atlantic City when the card reader had told me water would find ways into my life I couldn't predict or prevent. I'd laughed then, dismissing it as cold reading and calculated vagueness. I wasn't laughing now. The radio crackled. Through the static came something that might have been a voice, might have been water forcing its way through pipes, might have been nothing at all. But part of my mind insisted it was saying one word over and over: down. The evacuation siren screamed again. This time it didn't stop after 30 seconds. It continued, building in intensity and pitch until it no longer sounded like a mechanical warning, but something organic, something with lungs and vocal cords straining to produce sounds that would make me move, make me react, make me understand that staying here was choosing to drown. I grabbed my equipment and ran toward the gap between containers. The lights were pulsing faster now, matching my heartbeat, or perhaps driving it, and the water below had risen another foot, now lapping at the lower deck's edge. The figure on the breakwater remained motionless except for that extended arm, still pointing, still insistent. I reached the gap. Up close, the hidden ladder looked old, older than the pier itself, constructed from a type of iron that hadn't been used in marine applications for decades. Each rung bore a patina of corrosion and something else, something green and organic that I recognized from underwater surveys. Algae, but algae growing in patterns, in bands that marked different levels like tree rings, or the layers of sediment in an archaeological dig. The bottom rung bore a fresh coating, still wet, still spreading. The one above it was drier, but equally marked. And above that, another band, this one weeks old, the algae already browning at the edges. I counted up, rung by rung, noting the progression. Each visit I'd made to similar sites over the past months, each time I'd encountered something I couldn't explain. They were all there, recorded in bands of dying algae climbing steadily upward. Tonight's mark would be one rung higher than last week's. Next time, one rung higher still. An advance measured in discrete increments, patient and inexorable, as if something was learning the geography of my escape routes and adapting accordingly. The siren cut off. In the sudden silence, I heard the water clearly. Not just waves against concrete, but something underneath. Something that sounded like breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing. As if the bay itself had developed lungs. I looked back at the breakwater. The figure was gone. But the puddle remained, a dark stain on concrete that should have been swept away by wind and wave action in seconds. Instead, it was growing, spreading toward the main pier like something alive, something searching. My hand found the ladder's top rung, cold metal, slick with moisture, solid enough to trust with my weight. I could descend, follow this infrastructure that existed in the gap between what was mapped and what was real. I could avoid being here when whatever was rising reached the level I stood on. Or I could stay, could wait, could finally confront what the card reader had seen in that inverted cup, the flood that was coming for me whether I ran or not. I descended 3 rungs. The algae under my fingers felt alive, pulsing with the rhythm of the water below. 4 rungs. 5. The lower deck came into view, awash now with several inches of seawater that shouldn't be there, that violated every principle of pier design and tide prediction I'd spent years studying. 6 rungs. 7. I was below the main deck now, in the shadows where maintenance workers rarely ventured. The water around my feet, because yes, I was standing in it now, my boots submerged to the ankle, felt warmer than it should, almost body temperature, almost welcoming. Above me, I heard the evacuation siren start again, but distant now, muffled by water and metal. The lights continued their pulse, faster and faster, until they were no longer individual flashes, but a continuous strobe that made the water's surface look like it was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in perfect synchronization with whatever I'd heard earlier. I looked up at the ladder. Tonight's algae mark was at eye level now. I was below it. For the first time in 8 months of increasingly strange incidents, I descended below the level that something wanted me to reach. The water around my feet began to swirl, forming a gentle vortex with me at its center. Not threatening, not violent, curious perhaps, like something finally making direct contact after months of peripheral approach. I felt pressure against my ankles, then my calves, as if hands were exploring, learning the dimensions of what they'd been reaching for. My radio produced one final burst of static, and this time the pattern was unmistakable. 3 syllables that matched the rhythm of the water's breathing. 3 syllables that might have been a name, or might have been coordinates, or might have been the sound water makes when it finally finds what it's been seeking. The vortex tightened. I grabbed the ladder, ready to climb back up, ready to break the surface and return to the world of flood barriers and stress tests and mechanical certainty. But when I looked up, I saw the algae marks descending rung by rung above me, fresh and wet and growing, as if they'd always been there and I'd simply been too far away to see them clearly. The future wasn't chasing me. It had already arrived. I'd just been climbing into it one rung at a time, mistaking descent for escape. The water reached my knees. The lights pulsed once more, a final lingering pulse that lasted far too long, then stabilized to steady, normal illumination. The evacuation siren went silent. The radio produced only clean static, the sound of empty frequencies. And somewhere above me, on a breakwater that may or may not have collapsed 3 years ago, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Wet, patient, taking their time because there was no hurry. Because I'd already made the choice the moment I touched that first rung. The algae on the ladder continued growing, spreading upward and downward simultaneously, marking past and future in the same green bands, recording visits I hadn't made yet to sites I didn't know existed. I counted the rungs above me. 14 remained unmarked. 14 more times I would return, would find new gaps between containers, new ladders descending into water that rose despite all predictions, all certainty, all denial. The card reader had been wrong about only one thing. It wasn't emotional flooding I needed to fear. It was the literal kind. The water that comes for engineers who build barriers, who trust in concrete and hydraulics, and the illusion of control over forces that were never meant to be contained. I climbed, not up toward the main deck where my equipment waited, and the security guard would eventually notice my absence. Not down into the rising water that breathed beneath me, but along, hand over hand, moving horizontally through the ladder's rungs as if they formed the bars of some cage I could navigate sideways through sheer determination. The algae followed my path, appearing fresh on each rung my fingers touched, as if I weren't escaping the mark but creating it, carrying it with me like some contagion that would eventually cover every surface I contacted. When I finally emerged, through what gap, in what container, on what pier, I couldn't say with certainty. The sky was lightening with dawn, and my clothes were dry, and my equipment was packed neatly in my truck as if I'd already finished the job and prepared to leave. But my boots bore fresh algae stains, green and wet, and climbing higher up the leather than they had the week before. I drive past Pier 47 sometimes, though never at night, never when the tide tables show slack periods that might not be slack at all. The barriers passed their stress test. The Port Authority signed off. The harbor master never mentioned any emergency calls, any evacuation sirens, any anomalies in the overnight report. but I know I'll go back. Not tonight, maybe not for weeks, but eventually when the pressure in my chest becomes too much and the memory of that card reader's wet fingerprints drives me toward water despite every rational thought screaming to stay away. And when I do, the algae will have climbed another rung. The figure will be waiting on impossible concrete. The evacuation siren will teach me something new about panic. The future is patient. It's had decades to practice rising, one tide at a time, learning the rhythm of men who think they can measure it, contain it, predict its movements with sensors and data and desperate faith in human engineering. I'm on rung 7 now. 14 remain. I wonder what's waiting at the bottom, or if there is a bottom at all, or if it's just rungs descending forever into water that breathes and thinks and remembers every time I tried to run. The card reader would probably know. But I can't go back to Atlantic City. Not after discovering that her storefront is 12 feet below sea level, has been for 3 years, should have flooded during the first hurricane of that season. Should have, but didn't. Just like I should have drowned weeks ago, should have been pulled under by currents that exist in the gaps between what we map and what we believe. The algae on my boots is still growing. I've stopped trying to clean it off. Acceptance, I've learned, is its own kind of drowning. Slower than the literal kind, but just as complete. Tonight I'll sleep in my apartment, 17 floors above the street, as far from sea level as I can afford, but I'll hear it anyway. The sound of water breathing, patient and eternal, counting down the rungs I haven't descended yet, counting up the ones I have. Story 3. I don't believe in ghosts. Let me establish that first, before you dismiss what I'm about to tell you as the ramblings of someone predisposed to supernatural nonsense. I'm a software engineer. I deal in logic, in binaries, in concrete problems with quantifiable solutions. The universe operates on principles we can measure, test, and replicate. That's what I told myself anyway, before that week in Denver when my partner flew to Portland for a conference and left me alone with the cats. The apartment felt different the moment I closed the door behind her, not in any way I could articulate. The furniture hadn't moved, the temperature hadn't changed, the lighting remained the same amber warmth it always cast across our living room. But something in the quality of the silence had shifted, grown denser, as if the air itself had become watchful. I remember standing there with her suitcase still visible through the window as the Uber pulled away, feeling foolish for the prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The cat sensed it too. Diesel and Juniper, our 2 tabby rescues, had always been creatures of predictable routine. Diesel claimed the couch's left arm every evening at 6. Juniper preferred the windowsill in the bedroom, where she could observe the street below with regal disdain. But that first night, I found them both pressed against each other in the bathroom doorway, staring down the hallway toward the bedrooms with an intensity I'd never seen before. Their ears weren't flat. They weren't frightened exactly. They were focused, tracking something I couldn't see. I checked the hallway. Empty, of course. The mirror at the far end reflected the closed bedroom doors, the small table with its ceramic bowl where we kept the cat's water. Everything in its place. I went back to my laptop, dismissing their behavior as some quirk of animal perception I'd never understand. The intercom gave its first chirp around midnight. It wasn't loud, just a soft electrical hiss, the kind of sound that's almost below the threshold of conscious hearing. The kind that makes you pause mid-keystroke and tilt your head, uncertain if you've actually heard anything at all. I was working late in the bedroom, trying to solve a database optimization problem that had been plaguing me all week. The sound came again, slightly longer this time, carrying with it something else. A texture, a suggestion of voice hidden in the static. I pulled off my headphones and listened. Silence. Then, from somewhere down the hallway, a whisper of melody. So faint I wondered if it was coming from outside, perhaps from a neighbor's television bleeding through the walls. But no, it was closer than that. It was coming from inside the apartment. The hallway stretched before me when I stepped out of the bedroom. The overhead light. We'd never bothered to replace the bulb, preferring the softer glow from the rooms on either side. left it in perpetual twilight. The mirror at the end caught fragments of illumination and threw them back in strange angles. I'd walked this hallway thousands of times. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every subtle unevenness in the carpet. But in that moment, it felt unfamiliar, as if I'd stepped into a carefully constructed replica of my own home, identical in every detail except for something fundamental I couldn't quite identify. The singing grew clearer as I moved forward. Not words exactly, but a melodic humming. Feminine, gentle, almost mournful. It carried an old-world quality, the kind of folk tune that feels like it predates recorded history, passed down through generations until its origins blur into mythology. She was bent over the cat's water bowl. I saw her from behind first, the cascade of deep auburn hair falling past her shoulders, the fabric of her dress, some kind of vintage garment with high lacing up the back. The way she crouched with an old-fashioned posture, knees together, one hand extended toward the ceramic bowl. She was humming that strange melody, and her hand moved through the air in slow, deliberate strokes, as if stroking the head of an invisible cat. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion so profound it felt like vertigo. Who was this woman in my hallway? How had she gotten in? The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. My partner had come back early, though that made no sense given the red hair and unfamiliar dress. A neighbor had somehow entered the wrong apartment, though our locks were secure and we'd heard no sounds of entry. An elaborate prank, though who would orchestrate such a thing and why? I stood frozen, unable to move forward or retreat, as she continued her ministrations over the empty air above the water bowl. The humming rose and fell in gentle waves. Her hand moved with such tenderness, such practiced care, that I felt like an intruder witnessing an intimate moment I had no right to see. Then she lifted her face. The hallway's dim lighting played tricks, or perhaps it was the angle, but I couldn't make out her features. Where her face should have been, there was only a blur of pale skin, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. I could sense the movement of her head turning toward me, could feel the weight of her regard settling on my skin like a physical pressure, but I couldn't focus on her face. My eyes slipped away every time I tried, as if some protective instinct in my brain refused to process what it was seeing. She stood in a single fluid motion, the dress rustling with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent apartment. For a moment, one infinite suspended moment, we faced each other across the length of the hallway. Then she turned and walked toward the mirror. Not toward the bedroom behind the mirror, as geometry would demand. She walked into the mirror itself, into the reflection, and the glass accepted her like water accepting a stone. There was no splash of broken mercury, no impossible ripple across the surface. She simply stepped through and was gone, leaving only the empty hallway and my own reflection staring back at me with an expression of shock I barely recognized as my own. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for my legs to start trembling, long enough for the sweat to cool on my neck. When I finally moved, it was to approach the mirror with the hesitant steps of someone expecting the floor to give way beneath them. The glass was solid, cold to the touch. It reflected the hallway, the water bowl, my own pale face with mechanical accuracy. I pressed my palm against it, half expecting my hand to sink through, to find that barrier between reality and reflection as permeable as it had appeared. But it remained stubbornly, impossibly solid. I checked every window, locked, every door, secured. The apartment was empty except for me and the cats, who had emerged from wherever they'd been hiding to sit side by side in front of the mirror, tails wrapped around their paws, staring at their own reflections with unwavering attention. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was the caffeine from the energy drink I'd consumed hours earlier, not the fact that every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blurred face turning toward me. I worked until dawn, painted the windows gray, then called in sick to the office and spent the day researching the apartment building's history. Built in 1924, renovated twice. No notable deaths, no tragic fires, no sensational murders that would make local ghost hunter websites. Just a standard pre-war building with decent bones and creaky plumbing. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed. A clear historical tragedy would have at least provided context, a narrative framework to impose meaning on what I'd witnessed. The second night, I found the first strand of hair. It was caught in the baseboard molding near the mirror, about 4 feet off the ground, too high to have simply fallen there naturally. Deep auburn, almost copper in the lamplight, and far too long to belong to either me or my partner. I pulled it free and held it between my fingers, feeling the texture of it, undeniably real and physical. The cats watched me from their new preferred spot against the wall nearest the mirror, their eyes reflecting the light like small moons. Over the following days I found more, one tangled in the bathroom vent, another pressed between the pages of a book I'd left on the hallway table, a book I was certain I hadn't opened since before my partner left. A small cluster of them gathered in the corner where the hallway met the living room, as if someone had stood there and simply allowed them to fall. I didn't mention any of this when my partner called. How could I? The conversation would sound insane even to my own ears. "Honey, I think there's a ghost in our apartment. She doesn't have a face and she disappears into mirrors. Also, she's leaving her hair everywhere, and the cats are acting strange." Instead, I made reassuring noises about how everything was fine, how I was managing the place perfectly well, how I looked forward to her return. But I wasn't managing, I was unraveling. Sleep became something I attempted in 2-hour intervals, always with the lights on, always with the bedroom door firmly shut despite the fact that doors had proven no barrier to whatever was sharing our space. I started keeping a log, documenting each occurrence. The soft electrical hiss from the intercom at 11:47 p.m. The sound of humming at 1:23 a.m., this time coming from the bathroom. The sensation of being watched while I showered at 6:30 a.m., strong enough that I jerked the curtain open 3 times, revealing nothing but steam and tile. The cats abandoned their old routines entirely. They spent their days pressed against that hallway wall, occasionally reaching up with their paws as if trying to touch something just beyond their reach. At night, they would both sit in front of the mirror, perfectly still, for hours. When I tried to move them, they would cry. Not their usual demanding meows, but something plaintive and urgent, as if I was separating them from something they desperately needed. I began to notice other changes. Small ones, easy to dismiss individually, but unsettling in aggregate. The water in the cat's bowl would be disturbed in the morning, ripples frozen in the surface, as if someone had just trailed their fingers through it. The hallway would smell of something I couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar, like old flowers or rain on stone. The mirror would sometimes show reflections that didn't quite sync with reality, showing me turning my head a fraction of a second before I actually moved. On the 5th night, I saw her again. This time I was ready, or I thought I was. I'd positioned myself in the living room with a clear view down the hallway, laptop open but forgotten, every sense strained toward that darkened corridor. When the intercom hissed at its usual time, I was already standing, already moving forward. She materialized not from anywhere in particular, but rather seemed to resolve from the shadows themselves, like a photograph developing in reverse. Same auburn hair, same antique dress with its high lacing. She was at the water bowl again, but this time I could see her more clearly in the ambient light from the bedroom. Her movements had a ritualistic quality, the stroking of the air, the gentle humming, the way she would occasionally tilt her head as if listening to something only she could hear. The cats were beside her, both of them, pressing against her legs, weaving around her in figures of 8, their tails high and their bodies relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since my partner left. They were purring. I could hear it from where I stood, that deep rumbling contentment that usually required treats and sustained petting. She noticed me watching. That blurred face turned in my direction once more, and this time I forced myself to look directly at it, to try and resolve the features that kept slipping away from my perception. For just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, I thought I saw eyes. Dark eyes, sad eyes, eyes that held centuries of loneliness. Then she was gone again, stepping backward into the mirror, and this time the cats followed her with their gazes, standing on their hind legs with their front paws against the glass, crying out in what sounded unmistakably like grief. I've stopped trying to convince myself it isn't happening. Whatever rationality I'd clung to has been worn away by repetition. by the accumulating evidence of auburn hair I gather from the baseboards each morning, by the way the cats no longer recognize me as their primary caretaker. They tolerate my presence now, accepting food and water with absent courtesy, but their attention is always on the hallway, always on the mirror, waiting for her return. My partner comes home tomorrow. I've been rehearsing different ways to explain, different approaches to describing what our apartment has become. But how do you tell someone that you've shared your home with something impossible? That the pets they love have transferred their loyalty to a woman who may or may not exist? That you've stopped trusting your own senses because they keep reporting data that contradicts everything you believe about the nature of reality? Tonight, I'm sitting in the hallway beside the cats, my back against the wall, facing the mirror. The intercom will hiss soon, the humming will begin, and when she appears, because I know now that she will appear, as certainly as I know the sun will rise, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to see if that impossible barrier between our worlds is as solid as it appears, or if, like everything else I've believed to be true, it's just another comforting lie we tell ourselves to make sense of a universe that operates on principles far stranger than anything we can measure, test, or replicate. The cats are purring already. They know she's close. And in the mirror's surface, if I angle my head just right, I can almost see her reflection beginning to form, resolving from shadow into something that wants desperately to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be real. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm no longer certain that matters. Story 4. The Queen Anne on Benefit Street had been subdivided so many times that the room I rented existed in what must have once been a servant's quarter, a narrow slice of the third floor with sloped ceilings and a single dormer window overlooking the cemetery across the street. The landlady, a woman in her 70s with hands that trembled when she counted my deposit, mentioned only that the previous tenant had left suddenly. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I needed the space. My dissertation on colonial New England funeral practices had consumed 3 years of my life, and I was determined to finish it in Providence, close to the primary sources. The built-in wardrobe revealed itself on my second night. I'd been hanging shirts when my elbow struck the back panel harder than I'd intended, and the sound that returned wasn't the solid thunk of backing board against wall. It was hollow, deeper, the kind of acoustic space that suggests volume. I pressed my palm flat against the wood and felt it give slightly, like a door with loose hinges. The seam became visible once I knew to look for it, a rectangle cut so precisely into the wainscoting that only the faintest shadow betrayed its presence. My fingernails found purchase in a gap near the bottom corner, and the panel swung inward on silent hinges, releasing a breath of stale air that tasted of rust and something chemical I couldn't immediately place. Burnt varnish, maybe, or old paint heated past its tolerance. Behind the panel, a crawl space extended into darkness. The angle was wrong for it to be simply dead space between walls. It slanted upward, following the roof line, and the opening was large enough for a person to enter if they crouched. I retrieved my phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. Scratches covered every visible surface. Not random gouges, but deliberate marks carved into the wood with something sharp enough to bite deep, but controlled enough to form patterns. They repeated in clusters, geometric shapes that might have been floor plans or circuit diagrams, or something else entirely. Something my academic brain refused to categorize. The symbols overlapped in places, as though revised repeatedly, and in the overlapping sections, the wood had been worn smooth by friction, by hands or fingers moving across the same grooves again and again. The smell intensified as I leaned closer. Iron, definitely. The mineral tang of old blood, though I saw no stains. And beneath it, that acrid chemical odor that reminded me of the preservation lab where I'd examined 17th century funeral artifacts. Formaldehyde, perhaps, or the residue of something organic breaking down in an enclosed space. I almost missed the inscription on the inside of the panel door. The letters had been carved with the same tool that made the symbols, each character gouged deep into the wood grain. Do not close once opened. My hand was already pulling back from the panel when the logic of the warning hit me. Not do not open, but do not close. As if the danger wasn't in discovery but in concealment. As if something needed to remain accessible. I left the panel open that night. It seemed prudent. The stairs to the attic ran up the exterior wall of my room, just beyond the door to the hallway. I'd heard them settle occasionally during my first night. Old houses breathe and shift with temperature changes, expanding and contracting in their own rhythms. But the sound that began after I discovered the crawl space was different. It started around 2 in the morning, a deliberate creak-pause creak pattern that moved from the upper landing down 3 steps, then stopped. Every night, the same sequence. 3 descending steps, then silence until dawn. I told myself it was the wood adjusting to the coastal humidity. Providence in October runs damp, and the house was over a century old, its bones saturated with Atlantic moisture. But the timing bothered me, always beginning within 15 minutes of 2 a.m., always stopping at the same point on the stairs. On the 4th night, I opened my door during one of the pauses. The hallway was dark, except for the faint orange glow of a streetlight filtering through a window at the far end. The attic door stood at the top of the stairs, closed and locked, just as it had been when the landlady showed me the building. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but the smell had changed. That same iron and chemical mixture from the crawl space now hung in the hallway air, faint but unmistakable. I closed my door and wedged my desk chair under the handle. My research suffered. The dissertation pages I'd planned to revise sat untouched on my laptop, while I found myself drawn repeatedly to the open panel, crouching at its threshold and playing my flashlight beam across the carved symbols. I started photographing them, thinking I might find references in my source materials. Folk magic diagrams, perhaps, or Masonic symbols from Providence's merchant class. But the patterns didn't match anything in my databases. They felt older, more primal, like the kind of marks humans made before written language, when the distinction between representation and reality was still negotiable. The scratches extended farther into the crawl space than I'd initially realized. On my hands and knees, I followed them upward along the slanted floor, the phone's light revealing layer upon layer of carved wood. Some marks were shallow and tentative. Others cut so deep I could fit my fingertip into the groove. In places, the wood had splintered under repeated assault, creating rough patches that caught on my clothes as I crawled. 20 feet in, the space opened slightly. Not into a room exactly, but into a junction where the roofline created a pocket of vertical space large enough to crouch upright. Here, the carvings became more elaborate, forming what looked like a 3-dimensional map. Lines connecting points on the floor to corresponding marks on the slanted walls, creating a network of relationships that my eyes couldn't quite resolve into coherent meaning. The smell was strongest here, thick enough to coat my tongue and throat. Something had been left in the corner. A leather satchel, green with mold, sat collapsed against the wall. I didn't touch it. Instead, I backed out of the crawl space slowly, my spine pressed against the opposite wall, unable to turn my back on that pocket of shadow where the leather bag waited with whatever it contained. That night, the stairs creaked all the way down to my floor. I lay rigid in bed, listening to the rhythm of descent, counting the steps. 14 total, ending directly outside my door. The floorboards groaned with weight, something heavy enough to make the old wood complain. Then silence. Not even the sound of breathing, just an absence of sound so complete it felt like negative space, a hole cut out of the ambient noise of the house. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I watched the thin line of light beneath the doorframe for shadows, for any indication of movement, but saw nothing. Whatever stood in my hallway had no shadow to cast, or no light to cast it, or no physical form to interrupt the photons traveling from the streetlight to my threshold. When dawn finally grayed the window, the weight outside my door lifted. I felt it leave the way. You feel pressure change before a storm, some atmospheric shift that happens in your bones before your brain names it. The stairs creaked upward, all 14 in reverse. I should have left. I'd paid for the month, but the landlady wouldn't have fought me for the remainder. I could have found another room, another house, another city if necessary. My dissertation could wait, but the panel remained open, and something about that felt important. A responsibility I'd assumed by removing the barrier. Do not close once opened. I'd opened it. The warning implied consequences for reversal. The crawl space began to change. At first, I thought my repeated entries were disturbing settled dust, making the space look different each time. But the changes were too specific for that explanation. The symbols shifted position. Marks I'd photographed one day appeared in new locations the next, carved into surfaces that had been smoothed 24 hours earlier. The network of lines in the junction point grew denser, adding connections that rewrote the diagram's logic. And the leather satchel moved. Never when I watched it, but always closer to the entrance, as if migrating toward the open panel through some process I couldn't observe directly. My dreams became architectural. I walked through houses built according to the carved patterns, rooms connecting in impossible configurations, staircases leading sideways or inward or through dimensions my waking mind couldn't properly visualize. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Someone walked the same halls, always in the adjacent room, always moving parallel to my path. I never saw them, but I heard their footsteps. The same creak-pause-creak rhythm from the attic stairs, now translated into forward motion through spaces that couldn't exist. I woke each morning with splinters under my fingernails. My hands bore scratches I didn't remember getting, thin lines across my palms and fingers that stung when I washed them. Dirt caked the knees of my pajama pants, and my feet carried the black grime of old wood dust. The chair I'd wedged under my door handle sat in the center of the room, carefully positioned, as if moved by someone who wanted to prove it couldn't keep them out. The landlady knocked on my door one morning, asking if I'd been in the attic. Someone had unlocked it. She'd found the padlock on the floor, the hasp bent open with enough force to warp the metal. I told her no, truthfully, though I didn't mention the nightly sounds on the stairs. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between concern and resignation, and told me to be careful. The previous tenant had complained about sleepwalking, she said, and had been found twice standing in the attic in his nightclothes, his hands moving through the air as if arranging invisible objects. That afternoon I checked the crawl space and found the leather satchel had reached the panel opening. It sat just inside the threshold, positioned precisely in the center of the entrance. Impossible to miss. The mold had spread, covering the leather in a gray-green fuzz that pulsed slightly in the flashlight beam. Not with life exactly, but with some other form of animation, some response to observation that made my stomach tighten. I left it there. I backed away and tried to work on my dissertation, but the words wouldn't come. My research on funeral practices felt suddenly irrelevant, a child's attempt to understand death by examining its ceremonies while missing the essential truth, that death wasn't an ending but a threshold, and thresholds could be held open or sealed closed, and the choice mattered in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The stairs no longer stopped at my door. They continued down, through the house, a rhythmic descent that proceeded into the basement and, I imagined, lower still, into foundations and substructures, and the dark earth beneath Providence's hills. When they reached the bottom, they began again at the top, an endless cycle of descent without arrival. I found myself in the crawl space without remembering the decision to enter. My body moved through the tunnel on autopilot, hands and knees navigating the familiar path, while my conscious mind watched from a distance. The junction point had transformed into something almost organized. The carved lines now formed clear pathways, channels that guided my fingers along their grooves. The symbols made sense in a way language couldn't capture. I understood their meaning without words, felt their instructions in my muscle memory. The work wasn't finished. That knowledge arrived complete and certain, as if I'd always known it. The previous tenant had started something, had begun a process that required continuation, and the crawl space had waited patiently for someone new to resume the task. The leather satchel contained tools. I knew without opening it. Sharp tools for carving. Specific measurements written in a notation older than numbers. I carved. The wood accepted my marks easily, the grain splitting along predetermined paths as if the patterns had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for revelation. Hours passed, or minutes, or days, time losing meaning in the crawlspace's darkness. My hands moved with certainty, adding lines and symbols to the network, extending connections that reached toward some endpoint I couldn't visualize but could feel approaching. The crawlspace grew larger as I worked. Space expanded ahead of me, the walls receding to accommodate new sections of diagram. The smell of iron and chemicals faded, replaced by the neutral odor of fresh-cut wood and something else. Something that smelled like the air before lightning strikes, ozone and potential energy. When I finally backed out, pulled out by some instinct stronger than the compulsion to continue, I found the panel door waiting. It stood separate from the wall now, a freestanding threshold that opened onto the crawlspace from one side and onto my room from the other, though the geometry of that arrangement should have been impossible. The inscription glowed faintly in the darkness, letters written in foxfire or some other bioluminescent decay. Do not close once opened. But the panel wanted to close. I could feel its desire like a physical pressure, an argument made in sensation rather than language. It needed to close to complete the work. The opening had been necessary for the carving, for the expansion, for the preparation. But closing it was how the transition finished, how the spaces I'd drawn in wood became spaces that existed in fact. My hands reached for the panel. The wood felt warm under my fingers, almost alive, pulsing with the same rhythm as the footsteps on the stairs. Behind me, my room looked suddenly unfamiliar. The walls at wrong angles, the window opening onto a view I didn't recognize, or had never noticed, or had been different all along. The choice felt inevitable. I'd been working toward this moment since I'd first pressed my palm against the false panel. Maybe since I'd rented the room. Maybe since I'd chosen to study death in Providence, where death was a colonial industry, and the boundary between living and buried ran thin. The work needed completion. The crawlspace had taught me that much, had shown me through symbol and scratch how spaces could be rewritten, how reality was less fixed than we pretended, how the right marks in the right places could redesign the architecture of existence. I began to close the panel. The stairs stopped creaking. The house held its breath. My hands trembled with the weight of the door, feeling its eagerness to seal, to finish, to transform preparation into manifestation. The gap narrowed, 6 inches, 4, 2, and through the shrinking opening, I glimpsed the crawlspace interior, no longer empty tunnel but furnished corridor, walls lined with doors, each door marked with symbols I'd carved, each door leading somewhere I'd drawn into being. 1 inch, half an inch. Something moved in the hallway outside my room. Footsteps, but ascending now, climbing the stairs back toward the attic. Climbing with my rhythm, my gait, my weight distribution across old treads. I was in the hallway. I was at the panel. Both locations occupied me simultaneously, and the contradiction didn't feel wrong so much as preliminary, a temporary state before final positioning. The panel clicked shut. The work was finished. The work was just beginning. I stand in the crawlspace now, or my room, or the hallway, or all three. The boundaries negotiable in this new configuration. The carved symbols pulse with dim light, showing me pathways through the house that weren't there before, or were always there, or will be there soon depending on which door I open, which threshold I cross. The leather satchel sits beside me, tools cleaned and ready for the next tenant, because there will be a next tenant. There's always a next tenant in a Queen Anne subdivided this many times, always another room to rent, another person seeking cheap space close to their research. The landlady's hands will tremble when she counts their deposit. She'll mention that the previous tenant left suddenly. She won't elaborate. They won't ask. And I'll wait in the walls, in the crawlspace, in the junction point where 3 dimensions failed and others took their place. I'll wait for them to find the panel, to read the warning, to open what shouldn't be opened and begin what shouldn't be begun. The stairs will creak for them, 3 steps down at first, then more as they grow comfortable with the sound, as they learn to recognize its invitation. And when they're ready, when the work calls them and they answer with carved wood and bleeding fingers, I'll be there, walking parallel through adjacent rooms, showing them through footsteps and silence how to finish what I've started. Because the work is never finished. That's what the symbols teach, what the crawl space knows, what the panel guards and reveals in equal measure. There are only iterations, variations, new tenants adding their marks to the palimpsest of scratches until the diagram is dense enough, complex enough, real enough to stop being representation and become the thing itself. The house breathes around me. Providence sleeps beyond these walls, unaware that its architecture has been quietly rewritten, one room at a time, one tenant at a time, one open panel that should never close but always does. I wait for the sound of fingernails on wood, for the gasp of discovery, for the moment when someone new reads the warning and makes the same choice I made, the only choice the work allows. Do not close once opened, but we always do. And that's how the work continues. Story 5. The Polaroid camera felt wrong from the moment I picked it up. Not damaged wrong. The leather case was scuffed but intact, the lens clear enough. Wrong in a way I couldn't articulate standing there in that roadside thrift store outside Flagstaff, Arizona, with its smell of old magazines and someone else's abandoned lives. The woman behind the counter, her face a roadmap of sun damage and cigarette smoke, told me it had come in with an estate sale from Sedona. She didn't know anything else, and I didn't ask. $45 seemed reasonable for a camera that looked like it still worked. I should have noticed her expression when I paid. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it, like she was glad to see it go. The motel parking lot was empty except for my rental car and a semi-truck idling 3 spaces down. Late afternoon sun turned everything copper and gold, that particular Arizona light that makes the world look like it's burning from the inside. I loaded the film pack, feeling the mechanical click as it seated properly, and pointed the camera at the motel sign, the familiar whir and mechanical spit of a developing photograph. I shook it gently, watching the image emerge in that chemical bloom of color. That's when I saw her for the first time. She stood in the photo's background behind where I'd been standing, visible in the chrome reflection of a pickup truck's bumper. A woman in what looked like Victorian-era clothing, high-necked and severe, with an elaborate necklace that caught the light in strange ways. Her face was turned toward the camera, toward me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not threatening exactly, more like recognition. I turned around. The parking lot remained empty except for my car and the distant truck. No woman, no one at all. The back of my neck prickled with that ancient sensation of being watched, that evolutionary holdover that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah. I took another photo immediately, pointing the camera at the same angle, waited for it to develop, my thumb leaving a sweat mark on the white border. She was there again. Closer this time, reflected in my car's rear window. The necklace seemed more elaborate in this shot, heavy chains and pendant pieces that looked almost ecclesiastical. Her eyes were dark hollows in the developing image, but I felt their weight all the same. I spent the next hour trying to rationalize it. Double exposure, maybe, though I'd just loaded fresh film. Some flaw in the optics creating a persistent ghost image. I took photos of the sunset, the parking lot, the motel's flickering neon sign. In every shot where there was a reflective surface, car paint, window glass, the chrome edge of a soda machine, she appeared, always behind me, always watching. The worst was the photo of my motel room door. She stood reflected in the brass number plate, so close that I should have been able to feel her breath on my neck. By nightfall, I'd convinced myself it was the camera. Cameras could be defective. Film could be corrupted. I drove to a Walmart on the outskirts of Phoenix, bought a disposable camera and a cheap digital one, both sealed in plastic that crackled when I tore it open. In the parking lot, under sodium lights that turned everything jaundiced and strange, I took identical photos with all 3 cameras. The Polaroid showed her in the reflection of a shopping cart's metal basket. The disposable camera showed her too, smaller but unmistakable, in the glass door of the entrance. The digital camera's LCD screen displayed her image for 3 seconds before the whole device froze, screen flickering once, twice, then going dark. When I managed to restart it, the photo was gone. In its place was a corrupted file that, when I opened it, showed only static, and what might have been the outline of a hand reaching toward the lens. The smell hit me then. Dry, ancient dust. Like opening a tomb, or a long-sealed attic. It came from nowhere and everywhere, filling my nostrils until I could taste it, gritty and wrong. I sat in the rental car with all the windows down, breathing the desert night air, trying to clear my head. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every reflective surface in the motel room felt like a trap. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel, unplugged the television, angled the window blinds to eliminate any possible reflection. But I could still feel her presence, a weight in the air that made my skin crawl. Twice I woke from a half-doze with the absolute certainty that someone was standing at the foot of the bed, and twice I snapped my eyes open to find only darkness and the red digital glow of the alarm clock. The rational part of my mind kept offering explanations. Stress, fatigue, some kind of strange coincidence amplified by isolation and too much driving. But rationality felt thin here, stretched over something darker and less comprehensible. I left Phoenix heading east, putting distance between myself and that thrift store as if geography could solve this. But she followed. In the side mirror of a gas station outside Holbrook, reflected in the polished surface of a diner's napkin dispenser, visible in the dark screen of my phone when I tried to call my brother and lost signal. Each appearance felt more intentional than the last, more deliberate. The necklace grew more elaborate with each sighting, adding chains and pendants that seemed to move between photographs, rearranging themselves into patterns I almost recognized. In Albuquerque, I found a vintage camera shop run by a man who looked like he'd been developing film since the invention of photography. His hands shook slightly as he examined the Polaroid, and I watched his expression change as he tested it. He took a photo of his workbench, waited for it to develop. I saw the exact moment he noticed her, the way his jaw tightened, the slight backward lean of his shoulders. He told me the camera was functioning perfectly. Then he asked me where I'd gotten it, and when I told him, he nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. He suggested I might want to get rid of it, and when I asked what he meant, he said nothing. Just handed it back and told me he couldn't help me. On my way out, I glanced back and saw him making a phone call, his expression grave. The dream started in Santa Fe. Not nightmares exactly. More like memories that didn't belong to me. A house I'd never seen, Victorian and sprawling, with rooms that led into other rooms in geometries that defied logic. Always I was searching for something, moving through dim corridors lined with mirrors. And always she was there, just visible in my peripheral vision. The necklace in the dreams wasn't jewelry. It was something else, something older. Bones and metal and stones that pulsed with a light that hurt to look at directly. I woke from these dreams with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that I'd been somewhere real. By the time I reached Oklahoma City, I'd stopped photographing anything directly. But it didn't matter. She appeared anyway, in the reflection of restaurant windows, in the polished chrome of door handles, in the dark glass of my car's instrument panel at night. Each time a little closer, a little clearer, I began to notice details. The high collar of her dress was fastened with buttons that looked like vertebrae. The necklace chains were inscribed with symbols I recognized from nowhere, yet somehow knew. Her face remained partially obscured, but I caught glimpses. Pale skin, dark hair pinned in an elaborate style, lips that never quite moved. The worst part was beginning to see her without a camera at all. It started small. A flicker in a mirror when I turned my head too quickly. A shadow in a window that didn't match my own. But it escalated. In a Memphis hotel room, I saw her clearly reflected in the bathroom mirror for a full 3 seconds, standing directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt her breath. When I spun around, nothing. When I looked back, she was gone from the mirror too, but the smell of old dust lingered. I stopped using mirrors, stopped looking at reflective surfaces, but she'd found other ways to appear. In the bottom of a coffee cup, her face looking up at me from the dark liquid. In a puddle after rain, standing beneath me like I was hovering over water. In the blank screen of my laptop when it went to sleep. Emerging gradually from the darkness like something developing in a chemical bath. I tried researching her, though I couldn't explain what I was researching. Victorian photography and spirit mediums, double exposure techniques, persistent images and camera obscura, urban legends about haunted cameras. Nothing fit exactly, but fragments resonated, stories about photographs that captured more than light, about images that persisted between frames, about the spaces between observer and observed where strange things could slip through. In Nashville, I met someone who claimed to understand. A woman who ran a bookstore specializing in occult literature, who listened to my story with an expression that never quite reached belief or disbelief. She told me about sympathetic images, about the way certain objects could create connections between worlds. She asked if I'd tried to photograph her directly, and when I explained what happened, the camera freezing, the blank photo, the smell, she nodded slowly. She told me that some presences don't want to be seen directly, only obliquely, in reflection and periphery. She suggested that perhaps the woman in the photographs wasn't trying to haunt me, but rather trying to show me something, or trying to use me to see. That night I tried it, set up the Polaroid facing a full-length mirror in my hotel room, positioned myself in the frame, and took a photograph of my own reflection. The camera didn't freeze this time. It expelled the photo normally, that familiar mechanical spit. But when the image developed, it wasn't my reflection looking back at me. It was her, full and complete, wearing that elaborate necklace that seemed to writhe in the photograph's chemical colors. Her face was fully visible for the first time. Beautiful in an unsettling way, like a painting that's technically perfect, but captures something fundamentally wrong about human features. And she was reaching forward, her hand extended toward the camera, toward me, with an expression that might have been desperate or hungry or both. Behind her in the photograph, where my reflection should have been, I saw the Victorian house from my dreams, and in that house's many windows, I saw myself over and over, reflected and re-reflected, trapped in infinite regression. The smell of dust became overwhelming. The hotel room's lights flickered and dimmed, and in that moment of near darkness, I felt something I can't adequately describe, a pulling sensation, like being drawn toward a mirror's surface, like reality was thinner than I'd ever imagined, and something on the other side was pulling me through. I threw the photograph down and stepped back. The sensation stopped immediately. The lights returned to normal, but when I looked at the photograph on the floor, it had changed. She was still there, still reaching, but now her mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a word or both. I left Nashville at 3 a.m. driving east with no particular destination, but I knew it didn't matter where I went. She wasn't in the camera or the photographs anymore. She was in me, or I was in her, or we'd become entangled in some way I didn't understand. Now I see her everywhere, not just in reflections, but standing at the edges of rooms, walking parallel to me on the other side of plate glass windows, sitting in my car's passenger seat when I glance right too quickly. The necklace pulses with that strange light even in broad daylight, and I've begun to recognize the symbols carved into it. They're not quite language, not quite mathematics, but something that contains both. Last night I caught my reflection in a store window and didn't recognize my face at first. The features were wrong, or rather, they were mine, but rearranged in subtle ways, becoming gradually more like hers. The collar of my shirt seemed higher than I remembered. Something around my neck caught the light strangely. This morning I noticed my hands in the bathroom mirror as I washed them. There was a faint mark on my wrist, dark and linear, that might have been a vein or might have been the beginning of a chain. I don't use the camera anymore. I don't need to. She's always visible now, standing just behind me, just slightly out of direct sight. Sometimes I think I'm her reflection. Sometimes I think she's mine. Sometimes I can't remember which one of us bought the camera in Arizona, and which one of us has been trapped in someone else's photographs all along. The necklace grows heavier each day. Even though I'm not wearing anything around my neck, I can feel its weight all the same. Tonight, I'm going to turn around and look at her directly. Not in a reflection, not in a photograph, but face to face. Maybe that's what she's been waiting for all along. Maybe that's what I've been waiting for. Or maybe we've both been waiting for you to read this, to look at these words on a screen, to see yourself reflected in this story. Do you feel her standing behind you now? Don't turn around yet. Not until you're sure which side of the reflection you're really on. Story 6. The canoe was tied backward. I stood at the edge of the dock, squinting against the October sun cutting across Lake Placid, and tried to remember if I'd secured it that way before leaving in May. The aluminum hull faced the shore instead of the water, its rope wound twice around the cleat in a pattern I didn't recognize but somehow knew. My father-in-law had always tied it exactly like that. Practical, tight, impossible to slip loose even in a storm. He'd been gone 14 months. The air smelled of wet pine and decay, that particular Adirondack autumn scent that lives in the space between summer's end and winter's arrival. I shifted my duffel bag to my other shoulder and walked the length of the dock, my footsteps hollow against the weathered planks. The cabin stood 50 yards back from the shore, its cedar shingles dark with age and moisture, windows reflecting nothing but the dense wall of spruce and birch pressing in from all sides. I'd come alone this time. My wife had insisted she couldn't get away from work, though I'd heard the relief in her voice when she'd said it. Our daughters had school, commitments, lives that didn't include October weekends at a family cabin that no longer felt like family. Just me then, to close the place down for winter, drain the pipes, cover the furniture, make sure everything was secure before the snow came. The key was supposed to be under the third stone to the left of the porch steps. That's where we'd kept it for 20 years, since the old man first brought us up here and showed us the property, with the kind of pride that made you understand this place was more than wood and land. It was legacy, permanence, the one thing that didn't change. The stone was exactly where it should have been, but the key wasn't under it. I checked the other stones, then the flower pot by the door, then the ledge above the window frame. Nothing. I was about to head back to the car for the spare set when I noticed the railing along the deck. The key sat balanced on the top beam, perfectly centered, catching the light. My hand hesitated before taking it. The metal was warm, as if someone had been holding it. Inside, the cabin felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately name. The furniture was arranged correctly, the couch facing the stone fireplace, the rocking chair in its corner by the bookshelf, the oval dining table centered under the antler chandelier my wife had always hated, but the air was different. Not stale, the way a closed cabin should smell after 5 months of emptiness. It smelled lived in, coffee and wood smoke and something else underneath. Something I associated with the old man. That particular combination of Old Spice and machine oil that used to cling to his flannel shirts. I dropped my bag and moved through the space, checking rooms with the methodical attention he'd taught me. Kitchen, clean, everything put away. Bedrooms, beds made, closets closed. Bathroom, dry, no signs of leaks or moisture. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the wool blanket folded on the dock bench visible through the window. I definitely hadn't left a blanket out there. The afternoon dissolved into routine maintenance. I worked with the mindless efficiency of muscle memory, following the same closing checklist the old man had created and laminated years ago. Drain the water heater, shut off the main valve, pour antifreeze down every drain, check the propane tanks, test the generator, secure the shutters. Tasks that should have taken my full attention but instead left too much room for my mind to wander. The blanket stayed on the dock bench. I could see it through every window on the lakeside of the cabin, that splash of red against weathered wood and gray water. I told myself I'd deal with it when I finished inside, but even as I worked, I found myself avoiding that side of the cabin, taking longer routes between rooms to bypass the windows that looked out on the dock. The sun was setting when I finally forced myself to go retrieve it. The temperature had dropped with that particular mountain suddenness that catches flatlanders off guard, and my breath clousted in the air as I crossed the yard. The blanket was exactly where I'd first seen it, folded in precise thirds, the way military people fold things, the way he'd folded things. I picked it up, and something small fell from between the folds. A brass button, green with verdigris. I turned it over in my palm and recognition hit like cold water. It had come from his old Carhartt jacket, the one he'd worn up here every fall for 30 years. The one we'd buried him in because my wife couldn't stand the thought of giving it away and none of us could imagine anyone else wearing it. The button was warm. I dropped it. The metallic ping as it hit the dock seemed impossibly loud in the gathering dusk. I left it there, left the blanket, and walked back to the cabin with measured steps that wanted desperately to break into a run. Inside, I locked the door and immediately felt foolish. The old man had always made fun of people who locked doors in the mountains. Bears don't use doorknobs, he'd say, and there's nobody out here to steal anything worth stealing. But he wasn't here to make fun of me now. I made dinner from the canned goods I'd brought, eating standing up at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table meant facing the windows that faced the dock. The cabin creaked and settled around me, each sound distinct and identifiable in the way that old buildings have their own language. The pop of cooling wood, the tick of the ancient wall clock, the soft whistle of wind finding gaps in the window frames. And underneath it all, so faint I couldn't be sure I was really hearing it, the sound of someone walking on the dock. I told myself it was the waves, told myself it was the wind moving through the loose boards, told myself I was alone and tired, and the mountains did strange things to sound, channeling and amplifying and distorting until your own heartbeat could sound like footsteps. The walking stopped. The cabin was silent except for the clock and my breathing. Then, clear as a bell, close as if someone stood right beside the window. "Hey!" I spun, knocking my plate off the counter. It shattered on the tile floor with a sound like ice breaking, and in the ringing aftermath I heard nothing but my own pulse hammering in my ears. The window showed only darkness and my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the glass. The old man used to call out like that when he wanted my attention. Short, sharp, no nonsense. "Hey," followed by instructions, suggestions, critiques delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who'd done everything wrong once, so you wouldn't have to. I cleaned up the broken plate with shaking hands, sweeping the pieces into a paper bag because the cabin had never had a broom. My father-in-law had considered brooms unnecessary. If something spilled, you cleaned it up properly, not just swept it under something else. I found myself following his protocols without thinking, wiping down the floor with a wet rag, checking for stray shards, disposing of everything in the burn barrel out back. The barrel was glowing. I stood in the dark yard, bag of broken ceramic in hand, staring at the faint red glow coming from the metal drum 30 feet away. Nobody had lit a fire. I certainly hadn't. The barrel should have been empty, cold, waiting for trash that would be burned in the morning before I left. But I could see embers shifting inside, could hear the soft crackle of paper burning, could smell wood smoke drifting across the yard. I walked toward it because not walking toward it meant accepting that something impossible was happening, and I wasn't ready to do that. My mind grabbed for explanations. Maybe kids from the neighboring property. Maybe a spark from somewhere. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized and had lit it earlier without remembering. The fire was small, controlled, built the way the old man always built them. Center kindling surrounded by a careful arrangement of larger pieces creating maximum airflow. Efficient, no waste, perfect. I dumped the bag of broken plate into the barrel and watched the paper catch. The flames jumped, and in their light, I could see what was burning underneath. Papers. Dozens of papers covered in handwriting I recognized. I grabbed a stick and pulled one out before the fire could destroy it completely. The edges were singed, but the center was readable. Instructions, written in the careful block printing my father-in-law had used for everything official. Notes about the cabin. Maintenance reminders, measurements and diagrams for repairs that needed doing. The same notes I'd found in the kitchen drawer 2 months ago. The same notes I'd read and filed away and definitely, absolutely left inside the cabin. I pulled out another sheet, then another. All of them his handwriting. All of them documents I knew the locations of, could walk inside right now and confirm were exactly where they should be. But here they were, burning in a fire I hadn't lit, being destroyed by flames that shouldn't exist. Something moved at the edge of my vision. I spun, stick raised like a weapon, and saw nothing but trees and darkness and the faint glow from the cabin windows. But I'd seen something. A shape. A silhouette. The particular slope of shoulders I'd recognize anywhere because I'd followed them through these woods 100 times. "This isn't funny," I said to the darkness. My voice sounded small and stupid and very, very alone. The trees didn't answer. The fire kept burning. I backed toward the cabin, eyes scanning the tree line, and didn't turn my back on the yard until I was through the door. Inside, I locked everything. Door, windows, even the interior doors to the bedrooms. Rational thought said locks wouldn't help if something wanted in, but rational thought had left the building somewhere around the backward canoe. I was operating on instinct now, on the primal part of the brain that knows when you're being hunted, even if you can't see the predator. I tried calling my wife. No signal. The cabin sat in a dead zone, had always sat in a dead zone, and you had to drive 5 miles to the main road to get even a single bar. I knew this, had always known this, but standing in the dark cabin, listening to the complete silence outside, I felt the isolation like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The clock said 9 p.m. Too early to sleep, too late to do anything productive. I sat on the couch and tried to read, but the words wouldn't stick. My eyes kept pulling to the windows, to the reflections showing the room behind me and nothing else. Except once, just for a moment, I saw a figure standing behind the couch. I turned so fast I fell off the cushions. The room was empty. Of course it was empty. I was alone. I'd locked everything. Nothing could get in. Nothing was in. But I'd seen him, just for a second. Just a glimpse in the glass. Standing exactly where he used to stand when he was explaining something important. One hand on the back of the couch, head tilted in that particular way that meant he was about to tell you something you needed to remember. I grabbed my jacket and fled to the porch. The cold hit like a slap, but it was better than being inside with the silence and the reflections and the impossible. I stood at the railing, gulping air that tasted of pine and ice and the distant promise of snow, and tried to convince myself I was losing my mind. It would be easier if I was losing my mind. Mental illness was treatable. Grief could do strange things to perception. I could be hallucinating, could be so tired and stressed that my brain was inventing things. That would be better than the alternative. The dock stretched out into the darkness, a gray line against black water. And at the end of it, barely visible in the starlight, someone was standing. Not someone. Him. I could see the outline, the height, the build, the particular way he stood with his weight on his back foot and his hands in his pockets. The posture of a man who'd spent his whole life working outdoors, who knew how to wait, how to watch, how to be patient. He was looking at the water, looking at the place where the boat should be pulled up and secured, looking at the motor that needed checking and the gas that needed shutting off and all the small, important tasks that keep a place running through winter. "Hey," he said, and this time I heard it clearly, heard it with my ears and not just in my head. The single syllable carried across the water, familiar and impossible. I should have run, should have gotten in my car and driven away and never come back. But something in me, the part that had been trained by 14 years of fall weekends and patient instruction, recognized that tone. It wasn't threatening. It was guiding. The same way he'd guided me through 100 small emergencies and seasonal tasks. The casual authority of someone who knew exactly what needed doing and trusted you to do it right if you just paid attention. I walked down to the dock. My feet knew the path even in darkness, knew where the roots pushed up through the dirt and where the ground got muddy. I walked all the way to the end, where the air smelled of lake water and pine, and something underneath that might have been Old Spice. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't there. But I could feel something, some presence, some attention focused on me with the weight of expectation. The boat was pulled halfway up the beach, rope loose around the cleat. The motor housing was open, showing the Evinrude inside in need of winterizing. The gas line ran to the small portable tank that should have been shut off and emptied. I knew what needed doing, had done it a dozen times before, following his instructions, listening to his explanations about why each step mattered. I checked the motor, found water in the lower unit that needed draining, shut off the gas, disconnected the line, tipped the tank to empty the last drops, secured the housing, tied the boat properly, 2 wraps around the cleat, the knot he'd taught me that looked wrong but held in any weather. The whole time I worked, I felt watched, not threatened, not in danger, but observed with the careful attention of someone checking that you'd learned the lesson right. When I finished, the presence lifted. The air changed, became simply air again, cold and clean, and empty of everything except weather. I stood on the dock, hands shaking, breath coming in clouds, and didn't know if I should cry or laugh or scream. I walked back to the cabin. The door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it, had checked it twice, paranoid and frightened, but now it stood open 3 inches, and warm air spilled out into the night. Inside, a fire burned in the fireplace. I hadn't built a fire, hadn't even opened the flue, but wood crackled in the grate, and heat pushed back the cold, and the cabin felt exactly the way it had felt when he was alive. Comfortable, safe, maintained. His cap sat on the arm of the couch, the old stained ball cap he'd worn everywhere, the one with the local marinas logo so faded you could barely read it. I'd helped pack his things after the funeral, and I knew with absolute certainty, that this cap had gone to Goodwill with 3 bags of his clothes. I picked it up. The fabric was warm, slightly damp, as if someone had just taken it off after a day of outdoor work. I turned it over in my hands, looking for some proof it wasn't real, wasn't actually here, wasn't actually warm with body heat from a body that no longer existed. The clock struck midnight, 12 deep gongs that vibrated through the cabin's bones. I sat down on the couch, still holding the cap, and waited. For what? I didn't know. For another sign, another message, another impossible thing to confirm I wasn't imagining everything. Nothing happened. The fire burned. The clock ticked. The cabin settled into its night sounds. All familiar, all normal, all exactly right. I must have dozed, because I woke to gray dawn light filtering through the windows, and the fire reduced to cold ash. The cap was still in my hands. I was still on the couch. The cabin was silent. I made coffee in the old percolator, the way he'd taught me, because proper coffee required patience and attention. While it brewed, I walked through the cabin, checking everything one last time. All the winterizing was complete. Not just the things I'd done, but everything. The shutters I hadn't gotten to were secured. The gaps I'd meant to caulk were sealed. The front porch furniture I'd planned to cover was already wrapped in tarps and tied down tight. A full day's work, done overnight, while I'd slept on the couch. I loaded my car as the sun burned off the morning mist. Threw my duffel in the back, carried out the trash, did a final walk-through to make sure nothing was left behind. The cabin looked exactly as it should, buttoned up, secure, ready for winter. The cap sat on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, started to put it in my bag, then stopped. It didn't belong with me. It belonged here, in this place he'd loved, where apparently some essential part of him had decided to stay. I left it on the rocking chair, perfectly centered on the seat cushion. Outside, I took one last look around. The dock, the boat, the burn barrel, the tree line. All of it familiar, all of it peaceful in the morning light. No signs of anything strange or impossible or terrifying. Just a family cabin closing down for winter, the way it had closed down for 40 autumns before this one. I was halfway to my car when I heard it. Good job. 2 words clear as day, in a voice I'd recognize in any lifetime. I didn't turn around, didn't look back, just got in the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt road toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the cabin growing smaller, and maybe, a figure standing on the porch. One hand raised in the particular wave that meant drive safe. See you next season. My wife called an hour later, when I finally got into signal range. Asked how it went, if everything was okay, when I'd be home. I told her fine. Everything was fine. The cabin was secure for winter. She asked if I'd gone alone. I said yes, of course, just me. She was quiet for a moment, then said she'd been thinking maybe we should sell the place. It was a lot of maintenance, she said. A lot of memories. Maybe it was time to let it go and find something that was just ours. I thought about the backward canoe, the warm key, the blanket on the dock, the fire that lit itself, the cap on the chair. I thought about a year of grief we'd barely acknowledged, about a man who'd loved this place so much he'd made it part of his family's identity, who'd spent his last decade teaching me how to care for it properly because he knew, must have known, that someday it would be my responsibility. Let me think about it, I told my wife. Maybe one more season. I knew, driving away through the mountains with autumn bleeding into winter, that I'd be back in spring. Knew I'd open the cabin and find things arranged just so, and small tasks completed, and reminders of what needed doing. Knew I'd probably never understand what was happening here, whether grief had broken something in my mind, or whether some part of the old man really had stayed behind. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the point was simply this. The cabin would be maintained. The traditions would continue. The work would get done one way or another, whether I understood the how or the why or the who. The mountains rose and fell around me, ancient and patient and keeping their secrets the way mountains do. Behind me, the cabin settled into winter sleep, watched over by whatever haunted it. I told myself I wasn't scared. I told myself I'd been dreaming. I told myself a lot of things during that drive home. And by the time I reached the city, I'd almost convinced myself they were true. Almost. But next spring, when I returned to open the cabin and found the canoe tied backward, and a fresh pot of coffee waiting in the percolator and a note in his handwriting reminding me to check the dock supports, I knew I'd have to stop lying to myself. Some caretakers never leave their post. Some welcome you home, even when they're gone. Story 7. The dog knew first. That's what I tell myself now, sitting on the bottom step with Edison pressed against my shin, the first time he's touched the staircase in 7 weeks. The mezzanine looms above us in the darkness, that angular platform I spent 3 months planning and 5 weeks building. The crowning achievement of my first real estate investment. Exposed brick, reclaimed wood, Edison bulbs casting warm pools of light across surfaces that should feel like home. Should. The space had been perfect when I bought it, one of those converted factory lofts in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, all high ceilings and original timber beams. 1,200 square feet of open-plan living that felt simultaneously vast and intimate, but I'd wanted more. Not more space exactly, more definition. The architect in me, or the part of me that wishes I'd pursued architecture instead of property management, saw unused vertical potential. That cathedral ceiling could accommodate a sleeping platform. A mezzanine would transform the emptiness into something purposeful. I'd been so proud the day the final inspector signed off. The structure was sound, built to code, exceeding every safety requirement. The ironwork railings alone cost more than my first car. I'd even splurged on motion sensor lighting for the stairs, imagining bleary midnight trips to the bathroom made easier by automated illumination. Edison refused to climb them that very first night. I'd carried him up, all 70 pounds of German Shepherd mix, expecting him to acclimate within minutes. He'd always loved elevated positions, claimed the back of the couch as his personal throne, leaped onto my bed with proprietary enthusiasm. But on the mezzanine, he'd gone rigid in my arms, his breathing shallow and rapid. When I set him down, he'd immediately retreated to the stairs, descending so quickly his paws scrambled for purchase on the wood. I'd attributed it to the newness. New smells, new echoes, the unfamiliarity of the space. Dogs need adjustment periods. I told myself this while unpacking boxes up there, while arranging my bed against the far wall, while Edison paced below, occasionally releasing small, anxious whines. That first week, I woke repeatedly to his bark, sharp, urgent, directed upward. I'd peer over the railing to find him standing in the center of the main floor, hackles raised, staring at a point just above my head. Following his gaze revealed nothing but shadow and beam, and the convergence of wall and ceiling. When I'd descend, he'd quiet immediately, pressing against my legs until I returned to the couch below. I slept down there 3 nights in a row, unwilling to admit that my own dog had banished me from my expensive renovation. The sensor lights began their erratic behavior on day 9. I'd wake to find them flickering on and off, not the smooth fade of their programming, but abrupt strobes of illumination. The first time, I assumed it was electrical, some loose connection in the wiring. I'd spent an afternoon tracing every circuit, testing every connection, finding nothing wrong. The electrician I called confirmed my assessment, standing on the landing and shrugging while the lights behaved perfectly for his inspection. That night they resumed their irregular pulsing, and I realized the pattern wasn't random. The bottom light would activate, then the middle, then the top, as if something were climbing slowly upward. Then they'd all extinguish simultaneously, leaving only the ambient glow from the street-facing windows. I started watching those stairs in the dark. It became a compulsion, lying on the couch with Edison's weight pinning my feet, my eyes fixed on that ascending diagonal. The lights would cycle through their phantom climb, and in the moment between illumination and darkness I'd see, or convince myself I saw, a distortion in the air, not quite a shape, more like a thickening, a place where the shadows congregated with slightly more density than elsewhere. The cold came next. Milwaukee in November means cold, obviously, but this was different. The rest of the loft maintained a comfortable 68 degrees, while the landing at the top of the mezzanine hovered somewhere near 50. I could see my breath when I stood there, could feel the temperature drop as I ascended, a tangible boundary between warm and cold that had no logical source. I'd obsessively checked for drafts, for gaps in the brickwork, for compromised windows. Nothing. The building inspector I hired found no explanation, suggesting I call an HVAC specialist, who would inevitably find nothing either. I stopped going up there entirely by week 3. My bedroom, the room I'd specifically built, became a museum of my own ambition, my clothes hanging untouched, my bed perfectly made. I showered at the gym, kept spare clothes in a duffel by the couch, existed in the lower half of my own home like a tenant afraid of disturbing the landlord. Edison seemed satisfied with this arrangement. He'd resume his normal behavior as long as I stayed below, would even play fetch in the open space beneath the mezzanine's overhang. But if I so much as glanced at the stairs with intent, he'd position himself between me and them, a furry barrier of canine certainty. The figure appeared on a Tuesday. I'd been working from home, laptop balanced on the coffee table, video call with a difficult tenant dragging into its second hour. The man was complaining about water pressure, about parking spaces, about the quality of appliances I had no intention of replacing. I was nodding along, eyes wandering to the window, when movement pulled my attention to the stairs. Someone stood at the top. The impression lasted less than a second. A tall silhouette, dark coat, positioned exactly where the landing met the upper floor. Then I blinked and saw only the empty space, the railing, the shadows that had always been there. My heart hammered against my ribs. The tenant's voice continued from the laptop, oblivious, and I realized I'd frozen mid-gesture, my hand suspended in an abandoned attempt at professional reassurance. I ended the call with some excuse about another appointment, closed the laptop, and sat very still. Edison was staring at the landing. His ears were pinned back, his body lowered into that pre-fight stance I'd only seen once before, when a drunk had tried to force his way into my old apartment building. But now that stance was directed at empty space, at nothing visible, at the precise location where thought I'd seen, the figure. I told myself it was stress. The renovation had been expensive, more expensive than planned, and I dipped into reserves I'd promised myself I wouldn't touch. The properties I managed were bleeding tenants, the market softening, and my own finances reflecting that instability. Stress manifests in strange ways. Visual artifacts, paranoia, hypervigilance, all explainable. But Edison couldn't be stressed about my finances. I started documenting everything in a journal I kept hidden in the kitchen drawer, as if writing it down would make it more real or perhaps less real. I wasn't sure which outcome I preferred. The dates, the times, the specific manifestations, the lights flickering at 3:17 a.m., the cold spot measuring 47 degrees. The sensation of being watched while showering, of presence just beyond the bathroom door, the way certain floorboards near the stairs would creak under no visible weight. Week 5 brought the dreams. I was standing at the base of the stairs, Edison beside me, both of us looking up at the figure that now appeared with crystalline clarity. Tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a long overcoat that belonged to some earlier era. The cut was all wrong for modern fashion, the shoulders too structured, the length too formal. But the face remained obscured, lost in shadow even when the motion lights blazed. In the dream, the figure never moved, never acknowledged our presence, simply stood sentinel at the boundary between spaces. I'd wake gasping, the dream's residue clinging like cobwebs, and find Edison already awake, already watching the stairs with that same fixed intensity. The loft would be silent except for the ambient city noise, distant traffic, the building's old radiators clanking through their heating cycle, the occasional siren painting the walls with red and blue. And sometimes, in that silence, I'd hear footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, crossing the mezzanine's floor with the weight of someone real. But when I'd work up the courage to look, the space would be empty, always empty. The real estate appraiser came on a Thursday. I'd called her under the pretense of getting a professional assessment for refinancing. A lie that felt safer than admitting I wanted someone else to experience whatever was happening in this space. Her name was Vivian, and she'd been in the business for 30 years, had evaluated hundreds of properties, had the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that came from seeing everything. She arrived at 2, professional in her blazer and clipboard, and immediately complimented the exposed brick, the original beams, the open concept execution. Edison greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging, accepting her offered hand for inspection. Everything was normal until she noticed the mezzanine. Her assessment began on the main floor, measuring, noting, photographing. She asked about square footage, about renovations, about permits and inspections. I provided documentation, answered questions, watched her move through the space with practiced efficiency. Then she approached the stairs. Edison's demeanor changed instantly. The tail stopped, the ears flattened. He positioned himself between her and the first step, not aggressively but firmly, a barrier of intention. Vivian noticed. She paused, one hand on the railing, and looked at the dog with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she looked up, her gaze traveling the stairs to the landing above. The temperature dropped. I could see her register it, the way her breath suddenly misted, the subtle tensing of her shoulders. She stood there for what felt like several minutes, but was probably 30 seconds, her eyes fixed on the landing's corner, on that exact point where I'd seen the figure. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its professional cheerfulness. She told me there was nothing structurally wrong with the stairs, that the construction looked sound, that the permits were all in order. She said these things while backing away from the staircase, while maintaining that strange fixed stare at the upper landing. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that sometimes spaces don't welcome change, that sometimes buildings have their preferences, their established patterns, and disruption causes resistance. I asked her what she meant. She didn't answer directly, just finished her measurements on the lower level, declined to inspect the upper floor, said she could extrapolate from the plans I'd provided, and completed her paperwork at the front door. Before leaving, she paused, one hand on the doorknob, and finally made eye contact. "Someone doesn't like what you've done here," she said. That was her exact phrasing, not something. Someone. I spent that evening researching the building's history. The loft had been a furniture factory originally, built in 1924, operating until the late 70s before sitting vacant for 2 decades. The conversion to residential units happened in the early 2000s, and I was the third owner of this particular space. Nothing in the public record suggested tragedy or violence, no industrial accidents, no reported deaths. Just a building that had aged and transformed, its purpose shifting with economic necessity. But absence of documented tragedy doesn't mean absence of tragedy. How many private griefs, How many unrecorded losses occur in any structure over a century of existence? How many night watchmen, solitary craftsmen, late shift workers might have inhabited this space when it hummed with production? And more pressingly, how many of them had died elsewhere, but might have left something of themselves behind, some attachment to the space they'd known? I was thinking in circles, I knew, spiraling into the kind of magical thinking that rationality should prevent. But rationality couldn't explain the cold, the lights, the figure that I'd seen with increasing frequency. That figure now appeared almost nightly, always in the same position, always watching, always still. I'd stopped using the sensor lights entirely, unable to bear their irregular behavior, and the darkness made the apparition, I'd started calling it that, at least in my private thoughts, seem more solid, more insistent. Edison had stopped eating properly. His ribs were becoming visible under his coat, and the vet found nothing physically wrong, suggested stress, asked if anything had changed in his environment. I'd laughed at that, a sound with no humor in it, and lied about everything being fine. Nothing was fine. I was showering with the curtain partially open, afraid of what might be on the other side. I was sleeping in 4-hour fragments, waking at every sound, at every shift in temperature. The properties I managed were suffering from my inattention, tenants calling with complaints I'd forget to address, maintenance requests piling up unanswered. My business partner had asked twice if I was okay, his concern genuine and useless. Because how do you explain to someone that your own home has developed an immune response to your presence? That the space you've invested everything in, financially and emotionally, has rejected your improvements with something approaching intelligence? Week 7 brought the clearest sighting. I'd been lying on the couch around 2 a.m., Edison curled at my feet, both of us pretending to sleep. The city outside was quiet, that deep night silence where every sound carries weight. I was staring at the ceiling, at the underside of my expensive mezzanine, when I heard the footsteps. They were undeniable this time, heavy, deliberate, crossing from one side of the upper floor to the other. I could hear each step, could map the progress across the space, could feel the slight vibration through the building's structure. Edison heard them too, his body going rigid, a low growl building in his throat. I sat up slowly, every nerve screaming at me to stay down, to pull the blanket over my head like a child hiding from imagined monsters. But these weren't imagined. The footsteps continued, reaching the landing, then silence. I looked up. The figure stood at the top of the stairs, clearer than it had ever been. Tall, well over 6 feet, wearing that anachronistic overcoat that seemed pulled from the 1920s or 30s, dark fabric that absorbed rather than reflected light. The face remained obscured, but I could see the posture now. Not threatening exactly, but definitive. This was someone who belonged here, or believed they did, and my presence was the intrusion. We stared at each other, or I stared at where a face should be, for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Every survival instinct I possessed was firing contradictory signals: run, fight, freeze, submit. Edison's growl had become continuous, a low rumble of pure canine distress. Then the figure did something it had never done before. It moved. One step down, just one. The motion was fluid, natural, accompanied by the sound of weight on wood. The sensor light flickered on. I'd reconnected them that afternoon in a fit of false confidence, and in the sudden illumination, the figure was gone. But the cold remained. That bone-deep chill rolled down the stairs like water, washing over me in waves that made my teeth chatter. Edison bolted for the bedroom, my old bedroom on the main floor, where I'd been sleeping before the renovation, and I heard him scratching frantically at the door. I wanted to follow him. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, to get out, to spend the night in my car or a hotel or anywhere that wasn't here. But another part, maybe the stubborn part, maybe the part that had invested everything in this space, stayed rooted to the couch. I found myself speaking to the empty staircase, my voice hoarse from disuse. I said that I hadn't meant any disrespect, that I'd only wanted to improve the space, to use it fully. The words felt absurd even as I spoke them, but they kept coming. I explained the planning, the permits, the careful construction. I apologized, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. The cold began to recede. Slowly, degree by degree, the temperature normalized. The stairs remained empty, the landing clear. Edison's scratching had stopped, though I could hear his anxious panting through the door. I sat there until dawn, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The decision formed gradually over the following days. I couldn't live like this, hypervigilant, exhausted, afraid of my own home. But I also couldn't sell, not without disclosing what I'd experienced, not without cratering the property's value. And somewhere deeper, past the fear and frustration, I felt an absurd sense of obligation. This wasn't malicious haunting, wasn't violent or overtly threatening. It was resistance, territorial defense. Whatever remained in this space felt displaced by my renovation, pushed aside by my presumption. The idea came to me during a sleepless night. What if I undid it? Not physically. The construction was permanent, the mezzanine structurally integrated into the building. But mentally, what if I stopped using the space, stopped treating it as mine, acknowledged the previous claim? I'd already been sleeping below for weeks. What if I formalized that arrangement, stopped thinking of the upper level as bedroom and started thinking of it as something else? Storage, unused space, territory I was ceding back to whatever needed it. The thought brought unexpected relief. Like loosening a knot I hadn't realized was choking me. I stood at the base of the stairs that night and made a declaration to the empty air. I said that I understood now, that I'd been presumptuous, that the upper space could remain untouched, that I'd live below, grateful for the volume and light the open ceiling provided, and leave the mezzanine to whatever had been there first. It felt absurd. It felt necessary. Edison was watching me from across the room, his head tilted in that way dogs have when processing something unusual. I turned to him, about to call him over when I felt his weight against my leg. He'd crossed the room without me noticing and was now pressed against my shin, his body warm and solid and real. More importantly, he was touching the bottom step, not climbing it, but no longer maintaining his careful distance. His tail wasn't wagging, but it wasn't tucked either. He looked up at me with those amber eyes that had been filled with anxiety for 7 weeks, and I saw something that might have been relief. We stood there together, dog and man, at the base of the stairs I'd built, and would never climb again. The mezzanine loomed above us in the darkness, that angular platform of exposed brick and reclaimed wood and expensive ironwork. My bedroom up there remained perfectly arranged, my clothes hanging untouched, the bed I'd never sleep in made with hospital corners. The cold spot at the landing's edge persisted. The sensor lights still flickered with their irregular pattern. And sometimes, in those deep night hours when the city holds its breath, I'd hear footsteps crossing the floor above, slow, deliberate, belonging to someone who'd been here long before me and would remain long after. But Edison sleeps on the couch now, pressed against my side, his breathing deep and even. The properties I manage have stabilized. My business partner has stopped asking if I'm okay, and I've learned to live in the lower elevation of my own ambition. Sometimes I catch myself planning new renovations, bathroom upgrades, kitchen expansions, changes that would stay firmly on the main floor. Then I hear a creak from above, feel that subtle drop in temperature, and remember the unspoken agreement I've made with whatever shares this space. The mezzanine was supposed to transform the emptiness into something purposeful. Instead, it taught me that some emptiness serves a purpose I'd never considered, that some spaces aren't empty at all, just occupied by presences we've learned not to see. I don't know if what I experienced was genuine haunting or elaborate self-deception, whether the figure in the overcoat is residual energy or stress-induced hallucination. The ambiguity should trouble me more than it does, but I've found a strange peace in the uncertainty, in living alongside the unexplainable without demanding explanation. The loft still feels like home, even if I'm no longer certain I'm its only resident. Edison seemed satisfied with this arrangement, and his judgment, I've learned, might be better than my own. Last week, the motion lights stopped their erratic behavior entirely. They function normally now, smoothly illuminating the stairs on their programmed fade when I pass too close to their sensors, though I'm careful never to climb high enough to trigger the top one. That landing remains dark, temperature hovering around 50 degrees, belonging to whoever claimed it first. I tell myself I'm content with this. Most days I even believe it. But on certain nights when sleep won't come and the city sounds fade into silence, I find myself looking up at the mezzanine's edge. And occasionally, just occasionally, I see that silhouette against the darkness, tall and still and watching, but no longer waiting. We've reached our understanding, whatever it is. The space above belongs to the past, and the space below belongs to me. The boundary is the stairs themselves. No longer passage, but border. No longer connection, but division. I've stopped trying to understand why this matters. I've stopped trying to understand anything about this situation that defies every rational framework I've built my life around. Some mysteries resist solution, not because they lack answers, but because the answers exist in languages we've forgotten how to speak. So I live in the lower half of my loft, in the space that was always enough before ambition convinced me otherwise. I manage my properties, walk my dog, maintain the illusion of normalcy. And sometimes, in moments of particular stillness, I feel almost grateful for the presence above, because it taught me something essential about the spaces we inhabit and the spaces that inhabit us, about the difference between ownership and stewardship, between possession and permission, about the invisible borders we cross without realizing, and the prices we pay for crossing them. The mezzanine was my monument to improvement, to growth, to the fundamental human impulse toward more. What it became instead was a reminder that sometimes less is the answer, that retreat can be wisdom, that acknowledging defeat might be the most intelligent strategy. I sleep better now than I have in months. Edison's weight against my side is solid and real, his breathing steady, his nightmares, if dogs have them, apparently resolved. The temperature on the main floor stays comfortable, the lights behave themselves, and the footsteps above have become familiar rather than frightening. I've learned to live in the house that houses me, learned to share space with whatever else calls this place home. And if that makes me sound haunted, well, maybe we all are, in ways we refuse to acknowledge. Maybe every space we inhabit is already occupied, and we're the ones doing the haunting, imposing our presence on histories we can't begin to comprehend. The mezzanine stands above me still, beautiful and expensive and utterly unused. Sometimes visitors ask why I built it if I'm not going to use it, and I tell them the truth that sounds like a lie. It wasn't for me. They laugh, assuming it's a joke, and I let them assume. Because the real explanation, that I built a bedroom for a ghost, that I surrendered my own ambition to maintain peace with something that might not even exist, would sound insane. And maybe it is insane. Maybe I've constructed an elaborate rationalization for my own psychological break. Maybe Edison picked up on my stress and mirrored it back. Maybe every strange occurrence has a mundane explanation I'm too invested in mystery to accept. But on nights when the figure appears at the landing's edge, when the cold rolls down the stairs like a living thing, when Edison presses closer and we both wait for whatever comes next, on those nights, I know that the boundary between rational and irrational is as permeable as the boundary between my living space and the space above. Some thresholds, once crossed, can't be recrossed. Some changes can't be unmade. Some presences, once acknowledged, become permanent residents in the architecture of your life. I've stopped looking for ways out. I've stopped imagining what it would be like to reclaim the mezzanine, to sleep in the bed I built, to use the space the way I'd intended. That's someone else's dream now. Someone who hasn't stood at the base of these stairs and felt the weight of history pressing down through the floorboards above. The loft is enough. The couch is enough. Edison's breathing beside me is enough. And if sometimes I wake in the deep hours to find the figure standing at the top of the stairs, tall and still and watching, well, I've learned to nod acknowledgement before rolling over and pretending to sleep. Coexistence requires compromise, after all, even when you're never quite sure what you're coexisting with. Story 8. The brownstone had stood on Prospect Place for 137 years, and I was being paid $2,000 to live in it for 3 weeks, while its owners wintered in Lisbon. Easy money, I'd thought. The kind of gig that falls into your lap when you're between jobs and your cousin knows someone who knows someone. The first week passed without incident. I learned the house's rhythms, the radiators that clanked to life at 6:15 each morning, the third step from the top that groaned under any weight, the way the kitchen faucet hummed a half-second before water came through. Old houses have their vocabularies, and I was becoming fluent. Then came that Tuesday night. I'd fallen asleep on the couch watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures, those translucent things that exist in perpetual darkness. The television's blue glow had become my nightlight in this unfamiliar place. When I woke, the screen showed only static, casting the parlor in a restless, shifting gray. 2:17 a.m., according to my phone. That's when I heard it. The distinctive sound of the front door's brass knob turning, the internal mechanism clicking as tumblers aligned. Not the aggressive jiggling of a break-in attempt, but the methodical rotation of someone who had every right to be there. Someone with a key. I sat up, my mouth suddenly dry. Suddenly, the owners were in Portugal. I was alone. The sound continued, patient and measured. Click. Pause, click, a rhythm almost hypnotic in its persistence. I grabbed my phone, its screen brightness harsh against my adjusted eyes, and moved toward the foyer. The Victorian floor plan meant passing through the dining room first, its long mahogany table reflecting my distorted shadow across its polished surface. At the front door, I pressed my eye to the peephole. The fisheye lens showed Prospect Place exactly as it should be at 2 in the morning. Street lamps casting pools of sodium light, parked cars sleeping along the curb, brownstone stoops marching toward Atlantic Avenue. Empty. Completely empty. But the knob continued to turn. I pressed my palm flat against the door's painted wood, feeling the vibration through my skin. It was real. Undeniable. The tremor traveled up my arm, settled somewhere in my chest where my heartbeat had begun to stutter. Common sense suggested waiting, calling someone. But whose voice would I want to hear telling me I was imagining things? The owners were 8 time zones away. The police would find nothing, and I'd become the paranoid house sitter who couldn't handle 3 weeks alone. I flipped the deadbolt, a satisfying chunk of metal sliding into place, and yanked the door open in one motion. The rush of air hit me immediately, not the expected warmth of a building exhaling, but a profound cold that carried the sharp scent of linseed oil and turpentine, the chemical signatures of furniture polish and wood treatment. The vestibule between the outer and inner doors should have been still, insulated, but instead it expelled this breath outward with enough force to lift the edges of the mail scattered on the console table. The house had sighed. That's what it felt like, standing there in my boxer shorts and t-shirt as goosebumps raced across my skin. The brownstone had drawn in air and released it, and I'd simply happened to open the door at the precise moment of exhalation. I told myself this as I closed and locked the door. Told myself that old houses develop strange pressure differentials, that temperature changes create air movement, that there were perfectly rational explanations taught in basic physics classes. The next morning, I almost believed it. Almost. Until I noticed the marks. Condensation on bathroom mirrors is unremarkable, but condensation that appears as 5 distinct lines, each roughly the width of a fingertip, arranged in a pattern that suggests a hand pressed flat against glass from the other side. That gives pause. I wiped them away, blamed the shower's steam, the house's old ventilation. Then I found the fingerprints on the inside of the front door. They gleamed dully in the afternoon light filtering through the transom window, catching the sun at just the right angle. Oily residue, darker than the door's deep green paint, clustered around the handle at shoulder height. 5 prints from one hand, thumb and 4 fingers, pressed with enough force to leave clear whorls and ridges. I compared them to my own hand. The span was wider, the fingers longer. The placement suggested someone taller than my 5'10" frame, someone who'd stood very close to the door, palm flat against its surface. The owners had left 3 weeks ago. These prints looked fresh. I spent an hour scrubbing them away with wood polish, the same linseed-scented solution whose smell had poured from the vestibule the night before. The coincidence wasn't lost on me, but I focused on the mechanical task, the circular motions, the gradual disappearance of evidence. When I finished, I noticed the dust. The Persian runner in the foyer, a threadbare thing the owners called an heirloom, showed traffic patterns where feet naturally fell, lighter patches along its center, darker accumulation at the edges, except for one spot, roughly 2 feet wide and 6 feet long, where the dust had been displaced in a perfect rectangle, not smudged or scattered, but lifted cleanly, as if something had rested there and then been removed with surgical precision. The dimensions matched a person standing still. Very still. For a very long time. I found myself spending more time in the upper floors after that, away from the foyer and its implications. The brownstone's 3rd floor had been converted into a home office, and I established myself there during daylight hours, my laptop and instant coffee creating an illusion of normalcy. But houses, I was learning, have memories. At first, I attributed the sounds to the building's age. Brownstones settle, wood expands and contracts, pipes tick and hum their secret songs. The creak from the hallway at 3 p.m. could be temperature shifts. The soft thud from the 2nd floor at midnight might be books sliding on shelves. The whisper of fabric against wallpaper as I climbed the stairs was certainly just my imagination filling silence with narrative. Except I wasn't on the stairs when I heard it. I was in the office, feet up on the desk, reading about the history of Prospect Place on my laptop. The neighborhood had been developed in the 1880s, when Brooklyn was still a separate city, when these houses sheltered families wealthy enough to employ live-in staff. The article mentioned architectural details, property values, notable residents. It didn't mention what happened to those live-in staff when the families moved on. The sound came from directly below me, the 2nd floor landing. A distinct rustle, like someone adjusting their position after standing too long. I froze, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. The house's ambient noise continued around this new sound, the radiators ticking their afternoon countdown, traffic humming beyond the windows. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing else came. When I finally descended the stairs, each step deliberate and announced, I found the 2nd floor hallway exactly as I'd left it. 3 bedroom doors, all closed. The bathroom door, slightly ajar. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, creating patterns on the hardwood that looked almost like footprints, almost like shadows, almost like something that might move if I looked away. That evening, I made the mistake of checking the basement. The owners had warned me about it, told me the furnace was new, that I shouldn't need to go down there, that the stairs were steep and the single bulb unreliable. Sound advice meant practically. I'd interpreted it as such, until I noticed the door at the end of the 1st floor hallway standing open. I'd kept it closed. I was certain of this. The basement represented the house's unconscious, the part I didn't need to access or understand. Keeping it closed felt like maintaining a boundary, a clear delineation between the spaces I occupied and those I didn't. But it stood open now, revealing darkness that the hallway's sconces couldn't penetrate. Cold air drifted up, carrying that same furniture polish smell, mixed with something older, mineral dampness, stone, earth. I should have closed it and walked away. Instead, I descended. The wooden stairs were narrow, built for a century when people were smaller, or more careful, or both. My hand found the rail worn smooth by generations of palms, and I counted steps in my head. 12, 13. The bulb's pull chain brushed my forehead and I yanked it. Yellow light revealed a space larger than I'd expected. Not the cramped cellar I'd imagined, but a proper basement room with brick walls painted white decades ago, now yellowed and flaking. The furnace crouched in one corner, modern and efficient, looking out of place among the antique architectural bones. Wooden crates lined the far wall, stacked neatly, their sides stenciled with faded shipping marks. A workbench held ancient tools arranged with military precision, saws and planes and implements, whose purposes I could only guess. Everything covered in dust except the floor directly in front of the stairs. The concrete there showed a path, dust-free, leading from the stairs to the center of the room and back again. Fresh, recent, a loop that suggested pacing, or perhaps a patrol route, worn by repetition. I backed up the stairs without turning around, my hand finding each tread by feel, my eyes fixed on that swept pathway. The light stayed on behind me, and I told myself I'd turn it off later, in daylight, with the basement door firmly closed. That night I didn't sleep. I'd intended to. Laid in the second-floor guest room bed, blankets pulled to my chin, phone charging on the nightstand. But every creak became footsteps. Every shadow cast by passing headlights became a figure. The house's familiar vocabulary had transformed into a language I no longer understood, or perhaps understood too well. At 2:17 a.m., the same time as before, I noticed, I heard the front door's knob begin to turn. This time, I didn't investigate. I lay still, barely breathing, listening to that patient, methodical clicking. It continued for 7 minutes. I know because I watched my phone's clock, each minute feeling like an hour, wondering what kind of patience this required, what kind of purpose drove such persistence. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt worse, expectant, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I'd do next. I did nothing. At some point near dawn, I must have dozed, because I woke to gray morning light and the smell of furniture polish so strong it made my eyes water. The scent clung to everything, the bed sheets, my clothes, my hair, as if I'd bathed in it, or as if the house had rubbed against me while I slept, marking me with its particular chemistry. Downstairs I found the basement door open again. This time I closed it and pushed the hall table against it, a small act of resistance, largely symbolic. The table weighed perhaps 40 pounds, not enough to stop anything determined, but enough to make a statement. I see you. I acknowledge what's happening here. I am not participating. The day passed in a strange suspension. I worked from the third floor, avoiding the lower levels, ordering delivery rather than cooking. My cousin texted asking how things were going. I told her fine, great, easy money. What else could I say? That I thought the house was breathing, that something patient was teaching itself the rhythms of the place, the same way I had, that I'd begun to feel like I was sharing the space rather than occupying it alone. She'd have suggested I leave, find a hotel, cut my losses, but that would mean admitting I couldn't handle 3 weeks in a beautiful brownstone, that old houses and solitude had cracked something in me that had seemed solid enough. That night, I set up my laptop in the bedroom, its screen facing the door, and started recording. The video showed nothing. Hours of static darkness, the green glow of the hallway nightlight I'd installed, the occasional shift as I adjusted in bed. But the audio picked up everything I'd been hearing. The creak at 11:47 p.m., the soft thud at 12:33 a.m., the rustle at 1:15 a.m., and at 2:17 a.m., distinct and undeniable, the sound of the front door's mechanism clicking, patient and methodical, for exactly 7 minutes. I watched the playback the next morning, my hands shaking slightly as I dragged the cursor back and forth over the timeline. The sounds were there, real, recorded. Not imagination, not paranoia, not the fantasies of isolation. But the video showed only an empty hallway, a closed bedroom door, darkness undisturbed. That's when I started packing. Not to leave, I still had 11 days left, and I needed the money, but to be ready, to maintain the option of departure, to keep escape possible. My duffel bag sat by the bedroom door, essentials inside, like a promise I'd made to myself. The owners called that afternoon. A routine check-in, they said, just making sure everything was all right. Their voices crackled across the Atlantic connection, bright with European vacation and wine-dark afternoons. I told them the house was fine, that I was managing well, that nothing unusual had occurred. What could I say? That their home had a guest I hadn't been introduced to? That something was practicing being here, learning the space, establishing patterns. That I'd begun to feel watched, not by eyes, but by attention. That sense of being in another's awareness even when alone. They thanked me, said they'd see me in 11 days, reminded me to water the plants. After hanging up, I found myself standing in the foyer, staring at the spot where the dust rectangle had been. I'd vacuumed there days ago, erased the evidence. But now, as afternoon light slanted through the transom, I could see a depression in the carpet's nap. The fibers there compressed differently, suggesting weight that had rested long and consistently enough to alter the fabric structure. I knelt down, ran my hand across the surface. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. A persistent memory of presence, woven into the material itself. That evening, as I climbed to the third floor with my instant coffee and determination to pretend everything was normal, I noticed something new. The family photographs lining the stairwell, those sepia-toned portraits of Victorian ancestors, had shifted slightly in their frames. Not dramatically. Just a few millimeters off true, tilted at angles that suggested they'd been examined and then imperfectly replaced. I straightened them carefully, my fingers avoiding the glass, conscious that I might leave prints. As I adjusted the last frame, a stern woman in bombazine, her expression suggesting she'd never smiled even once, I could have sworn I saw movement in the photograph's reflection. Just a shift in the background darkness, the kind of motion that might be me turning away, or might be something else turning toward me. I took the stairs down faster than I'd intended. The next few days blurred together. I established new rules. Stay on the third floor during darkness. Keep lights on everywhere. Sleep in short shifts. Always with one eye on the recording laptop. Document everything, though I wasn't sure what purpose documentation would serve. Evidence for whom? Proof of what? The sounds continued, predictable as clockwork. 2:17 a.m. brought the doorknob's patient clicking. 3:33 a.m. brought footsteps on the second floor, soft and measured. 4:15 a.m. brought that sigh, that exhalation of furniture polish breath, strong enough to flutter papers I'd left on the office desk. I stopped trying to investigate. Investigation suggested I wanted answers, but I'd realized answers would be worse than questions. Better to coexist with ambiguity than confirm what I suspected. That the brownstone had never been empty. That house sitting had been a misnomer. That I'd been introduced to a space already occupied. On my 18th day, I found the second rectangle. This one appeared in the second floor hallway, outside the bedroom I'd been using. Same dimensions, same precision in the dust displacement, but this placement felt different, more proximate, as if whatever had been standing in the foyer for those first weeks had decided to move closer, to maintain its vigil from a more intimate distance. I moved my belongings to the third floor that afternoon. The house had 4 levels. Let it have the lower 3. But houses, I'd learned, don't respect such boundaries. That night, at 2:17 a.m. exactly, I heard footsteps on the stairs to the third floor. Slow, deliberate, counting each step the way I had, learning the vocabulary. The creak that came from the third tread, the slight give in the 5th, the protest of the 7th. They stopped outside the office door. I sat at the desk, laptop open but forgotten, watching the thin line of light beneath the door, waiting for it to be blocked by something standing just beyond, casting a shadow that would confirm presence. The light remained unbroken, but I could feel attention pressing against the other side, patient and curious, like a student studying a specimen, not hostile exactly, more like interested, as if it was learning me the way I'd learned the house, my rhythms, my patterns, my particular vocabulary. The doorknob didn't turn. The door didn't open. After 7 minutes, always 7 minutes, the footsteps retreated downstairs, each creak sounding in reverse sequence. I sat there until dawn, understanding finally what the owners hadn't said when they'd warned me about the basement. Not that the stairs were dangerous or the light unreliable, but that some spaces in old houses should remain unexamined, that certain presences should be left undisturbed, that house-sitting might mean something different than I'd imagined. The brownstone had stood for 137 years, and I was beginning to understand why its owners needed someone to occupy it while they traveled. Not to prevent break-ins or water plants, but to maintain the illusion of habitation, to provide company for whatever had been here longer than anyone remembered. I have 4 days left. The money will be in my account when I leave, and I will leave. Walking out the front door at the agreed-upon time, my duffel bag packed, my recordings saved to multiple drives. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I'll really go. Or if, like the furniture and photographs in Persian Runner, I've become part of the house's collection. Another piece worn into place by presence, my own dust rectangle forming slowly on the third-floor office carpet, marking the spot where I've learned to stand very still, waiting, patient and methodical, for the owners to return, or for the next house sitter to arrive. Story 9. The drill bit punched through the final layer of horsehair plaster with a sound like breaking bone. I pulled back, letting the dust settle, and peered into the cavity I'd opened in the Jacobson house, a 3-story Queen Anne that had been watching the Hudson Valley since 1890. The beam from my headlamp cut through the darkness of the wall space, and that's when I saw it. Not the expected tangle of old wiring or mouse nests, but a corridor. Not a gap, not a space. A corridor. It ran parallel to the existing hallway, about 3 feet wide, tamponated at both ends with blown cellulose insulation that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. But in the middle section, where my light fell, the air was clear. The floorboards were intact, dusty, but solid. And sitting there, centered perfectly on those boards, was a teacup and saucer. They were clean. Bone china, delicate, the kind my grandmother would have called good dishes. The cup sat in the saucer at a precise angle, handle at 3 o'clock. Around the base of the cup, barely visible in the dust, was a ring. The ghost of condensation, long dried but still discernible, as if someone had set down a fresh cup of tea and walked away only moments before. The impossibility of it stuck in my throat. The wall had been sealed for decades, maybe longer. The cellulose insulation at either end was compressed and settled, undisturbed. There was no way in except through the hole I'd just made. And yet the dust on the floorboards lay thick and perfectly smooth everywhere except around that teacup, where it had been displaced by something, by someone, setting it down. I reached for my phone to document it, already imagining the conversation with the homeowners. They'd hired me to install a safe in the master bedroom closet, a simple job that should have taken a day. Now I'd stumbled onto something that would require explanations. Maybe a historical society consultation, definitely a delay in the timeline. The phone's camera app opened, then froze. The screen went black except for a thin white line that flickered and died. I tapped it, restarted it, but every time I pointed the lens toward that corridor, the app crashed. Finally, I held the phone up without looking at the screen and tapped blindly where the shutter button should be. 3 shots. 4. The phone grew hot in my hand, and I caught a smell like burning dust. When I pulled up the gallery, my hands had started trembling. I couldn't explain why. The first 2 photos showed nothing but darkness and lens flare. But the third showed the corridor, overexposed and washed out, and threaded through the image were thin white lines, hair thin, dozens of them, suspended in the air like spider silk, except they glowed with their own light. They formed no pattern I could recognize, yet something about their arrangement made my eyes hurt, made me want to look away. I should have closed up the wall right then. I should have mixed a bucket of joint compound, sealed the hole, and told the owners I'd found structural issues that made the safe installation impossible in that location. Instead, I widened the opening. The corridor ran about 15 feet before the insulation blocked it off completely. I climbed through, my shoulders barely fitting through the gap I'd made in the lath and plaster. The air inside was different. Staler, yes, but also somehow more present, if that makes sense. It felt occupied in a way that empty spaces shouldn't feel. The teacup sat there, waiting. I crouched beside it without touching it, studying it in the full beam of my headlamp. The pattern was floral, faded but still visible. Roses and forget-me-nots, the kind of design that had been popular in the 1880s. The condensation ring troubled me more than anything else. Liquid doesn't leave marks like that on china without sitting for at least a few minutes, and in this dry, sealed environment, condensation meant the tea had been hot. Recently hot. I pressed my hand to the floorboards beside the cup. They were cool, the temperature of the surrounding wood. No warmth, no residual heat. But when I pulled my hand back, I could have sworn the dust pattern had changed, not disturbed by my touch, but rearranged somehow, as if something had breathed across it in the second I wasn't looking. That's when I heard the first voice. Not words, not exactly, but a murmur, like conversation in an adjacent room, the kind of ambient sound you tune out at a dinner party until you realize someone's been saying your name. It came from deeper in the corridor, beyond where the insulation blocked the way. I pressed my ear to the wall panel, the one I'd have to install to close this up, and the sound clarified just enough to be maddening. Rising and falling tones, the rhythm of discussion, and underneath it all, the delicate clink of porcelain on porcelain. A tea party. That's what it sounded like. A tea party happening in a space that didn't exist, beyond a barrier that hadn't been opened in half a century. I backed out of the corridor so fast I scraped my shoulders raw on the exposed lath. My headlamp flickered. The battery was fresh that morning. I'd checked it before leaving home, but now the light pulsed in time with something, not my heartbeat, which was hammering too fast, but with something slower, more measured. A breathing rhythm. I worked fast after that, cutting and fitting the panel that would contain the safe. The homeowners weren't there. They'd given me a key and told me they'd be back by evening. So I worked in silence, except for the sounds of my tools and my own breathing, which had gone thin and quick. But every few minutes I'd stop, listening, and I'd hear it again. That murmur of conversation, barely audible, coming from inside the new wall panel. The safe installation went smoothly. Too smoothly. The mounting brackets aligned perfectly on the first try. The concrete anchors sank into the studs like they'd been made for exactly those spots. My hands, usually steady, worked with a precision that felt automatic, divorced from conscious thought. I caught myself humming at one point, not a song I knew, but something old, waltz time, the kind of melody you'd hear from a music box. By late afternoon, the job was finished. The safe sat snug in its recess, the panel smooth and painted, no evidence of the corridor behind it except in my photos, which I'd uploaded to my laptop before my phone had finally died completely. The battery drained from full to zero in the span of 2 hours. I stood in that bedroom for a long time, just listening. The house creaked around me the way old houses do, the small adjustments of wood and nails as temperature shifts, as wind pressure changes, normal sounds. But underneath them, or maybe woven through them, I could hear something else. That murmur, fainter now, but persistent. And every so often, a sound like a cup being set down very gently on a saucer. I packed my tools in a daze, my hands moving through the familiar motions while my mind tried to rationalize what I'd found. Teenagers playing a prank decades ago, sealing themselves into the wall space with their contraband tea set. Except the insulation had been undisturbed. A former owner with peculiar habits, leaving offerings in the walls for luck. Except the condensation ring was too fresh. A hallucination brought on by old dust and poor ventilation. Except my camera had seen the light threads too. The homeowners arrived as I was loading my truck. They were pleased with the work, ran their hands over the smooth panel, tested the safe's combination. The husband mentioned hearing odd sounds in the walls sometimes, a sort of muttering he attributed to pipes or wind in the eaves. His wife laughed and said old houses talk, don't they? They paid me in cash and said they'd recommend me to their friends. I drove home with the windows down despite the October chill, needing the cold air to feel real, to anchor me to the world of highways and traffic lights and the paper cup of coffee I'd bought at a gas station. But when I got home and opened my laptop to file the job paperwork, I found 17 new photos in my upload folder. I'd taken 3, 4 at most. The additional images showed the corridor from angles I hadn't photographed, wider shots, as if taken from farther back, closer shots of the teacup, showing details I hadn't noticed, a hairline crack in the saucer, a small chip on the rim, and at the bottom of the cup, still visible, a dark crescent of residue that looked like tea leaves. The final photo stopped my breath. It showed my own back, my shoulders wedged in the opening of the wall, my headlamp illuminating the corridor. I was reaching toward the teacup, my hand extended, fingers splayed. I had never touched that cup. I'd been careful not to disturb it. But in the photo, my fingers were wrapped around the handle, lifting it, and my other hand held the saucer beneath it, catching whatever might spill. The image was perfectly in focus despite the low light. And in the darkness behind me, just visible in the extreme background where the corridor should have been blocked by insulation, there was a doorway. Not a gap in the cellulose, not a trick of shadow. A doorway with a frame and a threshold standing open, and beyond it, soft light like late afternoon sun through gauze curtains, and the suggestion, only the suggestion, of figures standing in a room, watching me, waiting to see if I would drink. I slammed the laptop shut. My hands were shaking so badly I knocked over the coffee, watched it spread across my kitchen table in a dark pool. For a moment, just a moment, the liquid caught the light in a way that formed a pattern. Thin white lines, dozens of them, the same glowing threads from the photograph, suspended now in cooling coffee, pointing toward something, leading somewhere. I haven't opened the laptop since. It sits in a drawer, powered off. But sometimes at night, in the boundary state between waking and sleep, I hear that murmur again, that conversation in an adjacent room. And underneath it, clear and close as if held right against my ear, the delicate sound of porcelain kissing porcelain, a cup being returned to its saucer after a long, satisfying sip. The tremor in my hands hasn't stopped. It's been 3 weeks. My doctor says it's probably stress, recommends a vacation, maybe therapy, but I know what it really is. I know because when I hold my hands perfectly still, when I concentrate in the right way, I can feel it. A weight, delicate and present, balanced in my palm. The weight of good china, the weight of a teacup, still warm, waiting to be raised to lips that might or might not be my own anymore. The Jacobson house calls sometimes. The homeowners, I mean. They're hearing sounds in the walls again, they say. Not muttering this time. Footsteps. And once very clearly the sound of someone brewing tea. The whistle of a kettle just on the other side of the bedroom wall, right where the safe is installed. They asked if I could come back and investigate. I told them I'd think about it. But the truth is, I've already started packing my tools. There's a pull, you see, a sense that I left something unfinished, some courtesy not observed. You don't refuse an invitation like that, not when it's been extended so clearly, so patiently, not when you've already accepted, whether you remember doing so or not. My truck is loaded. The drive to the Jacobson house takes 40 minutes. I've mapped it out, planned to arrive just as the afternoon light begins to fade, when the boundary between the world outside and the world inside the walls grows thin enough to step through. The teacup is waiting after all, and I've developed such a terrible thirst. Story 10. The fluorescent lights in the back warehouse had been flickering for 3 weeks, and maintenance still hadn't shown up. I'd stopped filing complaints after the 5th ticket disappeared into whatever void consumed requests at the St. Louis Goodwill Industries Administrative Office. Now I just worked through the strobe light effect, sorting donations into the massive Gaylord bins while that electrical hum drilled into my skull. It was the breathing I noticed first, not my own. I'd worked closing shifts long enough to recognize the particular rhythm of my exhalations in the cavernous space. The way sound travels differently when you're alone in 30,000 square feet of concrete and metal shelving. This was something else. A wet, labored wheeze that seemed to emanate from somewhere behind the towering stacks of furniture donations, back where we kept the items too damaged to sell, but too intact to immediately trash. I told myself it was the heating system. The building was old, built in the 60s, and the ductwork made all sorts of sounds, rattles, groans, sometimes what sounded almost like footsteps. The general manager had laughed when I mentioned it during my first week, explaining that every closing manager eventually started hearing things. It was the isolation, she said, the way the mind fills empty spaces with phantom sounds. But this wasn't phantom anything. I paused in my sorting, a chipped ceramic lamp base still gripped in my right hand. The breathing continued, steady and deliberate, matching no mechanical pattern I'd ever heard. It had rhythm, in, out, but with a crackling quality at the edges, like cellophane crumpling in time with each breath. The warehouse stretched out before me in rows of industrial shelving, each aisle a corridor of shadows that the failing fluorescents couldn't quite reach. We called them the canyons, these spaces between 16-foot-tall units loaded with everything the people of St. Louis no longer wanted. Clothes compressed into cubic yards of fabric, electronics stacked in precarious towers, books, thousands of them, their spines creating walls of faded colors and forgotten stories. I set down the lamp and moved toward the sound. My shoes squeaked against the polished concrete. We'd had the floors redone in September, and they still had that tacky quality that grabbed at rubber soles. Each step announced my presence, and I found myself wishing for silence, for the ability to move unheard through my own workplace. The breathing grew louder as I approached aisle 7. I'd worked this job for 14 months, and I knew every quirk of this building. I knew that the third Gaylord from the loading dock always smelled faintly of mothballs no matter what we put in it. I knew that the temperature dropped exactly 7 degrees in the northeast corner near the emergency exit. I knew which floorboards groaned and which overhead lights took longest to warm up after the timer shut them off at midnight. What I didn't know was what stood at the end of aisle 7. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The human brain needs context for visual information, needs to slot incoming data into established patterns. What I saw didn't fit any pattern I possessed. It was short, perhaps 4 feet tall, and hunched over in a way that suggested either deformity or the weight of impossible years. The silhouette appeared almost hunched beneath some invisible burden, shoulders rounded forward, head tilted at an angle that would have been painful for anyone still fully alive. It stood perfectly still, and in the stuttering light I could see that it was watching me, or at least it was oriented in my direction. I couldn't make out features, couldn't see eyes or a face or anything that would confirm the presence of a conscious mind behind that shape. But I felt observed with an intensity that raised every hair on my arms. I opened my mouth to call out, to demand identification, to ask who the hell had gotten into the building after closing, to impose some normalcy on the situation through the simple act of human speech. But my throat had constricted to something narrow and useless. The thing at the end of the aisle took one shuffling step forward. The sound it made was wrong. Not the squeak of shoes on treated concrete, but something drier, like the scrape of bark against stone. And beneath that, the breathing continued, that wet, crackling rhythm that seemed to fill the entire warehouse now that I'd heard it clearly. I took a step backward. It matched me, moving forward. I took another step back, faster this time, and again it mirrored my movement with disturbing precision. Not chasing, exactly. Following. Maintaining distance while refusing to let that distance grow. My hand found the edge of a Gaylord bin, and I used it to steady myself as I continued my retreat. The logical part of my brain, the part that had managed inventory and balanced cash drawers and resolved customer complaints for over a year, was screaming that there had to be an explanation. A person, a very sick person who had somehow hidden in the building during closing procedures, who needed help, who I should be assisting rather than fleeing from. But the older part of my brain, the part that still remembered when humans were prey animals, was shrieking a different message entirely. I backed down the main aisle, never taking my eyes off the figure. It emerged from aisle 7 with that same shuffling gait, and in the better lighting of the central corridor, I could see more details. It wore clothing, or something approximating clothing, layers of fabric that hung wrong, that moved independent of any breeze, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And its face. I yanked my gaze away before my brain could finish processing what I'd seen. Some images carve themselves into your neurons with such violence that you spend the rest of your life trying not to remember them. This would be one of those images. The office was 40 feet away, past the sorting station and the employee break room, through a set of double doors that I'd propped open with a doorstop earlier because the pneumatic closer was broken, and I'd gotten tired of wrestling with them every time I needed to check the computer. Those open doors now represented the worst decision I'd ever made. I picked up my pace, moving from a backward walk into something closer to a jog, my eyes still fixed on the thing that followed. It accelerated to match me, that shuffling gait becoming quicker without ever quite breaking into a run, always maintaining the same distance, always oriented precisely in my direction. The crackling breath came faster now, excited or exerted. I couldn't tell which and didn't want to know. I hit the double doors at almost a run, stumbled through, and immediately grabbed both handles to pull them shut. But the doorstop, that goddamn doorstop, was wedged underneath the left door, and no amount of pulling would close it with that rubber triangle in the way. I dropped to one knee and grabbed the doorstop, my fingers fumbling with the textured rubber. Behind me, I could hear the scraping sound growing closer, could feel the temperature in the corridor changing, warming in a way that had nothing to do with the heating system and everything to do with presence. The doorstop came free, and I lunged upward, slamming both doors shut. They locked automatically, a safety feature for after hours, and I stood there gasping, staring through the small reinforced glass windows set into each door at chest height. The thing stood on the other side, perhaps 10 feet back, perfectly still again. In the brighter light of the administrative corridor, I could see it more clearly than I wanted to. It was human-shaped in the way that a crude drawing is human-shaped, possessing the right number of limbs and features, but all wrong in their proportions and placement. The head sat too far forward on the shoulders. The arms hung at slightly different lengths. And the face. I forced myself to look away again, focusing instead on my own distorted reflection in the glass. I looked wild-eyed and pale, shirt soaked with sweat despite the building's standard 68-degree interior temperature. The thing tilted its head, an oddly curious gesture, and I could swear I saw its mouth move in time with that crackling breath. I backed away from the doors, my hand reaching for my phone. I'd call the police. I'd call my manager. I'd call anyone who might be able to explain what was happening, to impose order and logic onto a situation that had abandoned both. But before I could pull the phone from my pocket, the thing moved. It didn't walk toward the doors. It simply displaced, shifting from its position in the warehouse corridor to a point much closer to the glass, as if the intervening space had folded or been edited out of existence. No movement, no transition, just there, then closer. My hand froze on the phone. It happened again. A blink, and it stood pressed against the glass of the right door, its approximation of a face inches from the reinforced window. I could see the reflection of fluorescent light on its eyes. Yes, it definitely had eyes, though their placement was subtly wrong. And in that reflection, I could see myself standing in the corridor behind me. Except in the reflection, I wasn't alone. There was another figure, tall and thin, standing directly behind me. So close that if it had been real, I would have felt its breath on my neck. I spun around. The corridor was empty. When I turned back to the door, the thing was gone. The warehouse beyond the windows showed only the familiar landscape of bins and shelves and flickering lights. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except me. I stood there for what might have been seconds or minutes. Time had become unreliable, trying to process what had just happened. The rational explanations lined up and presented themselves. Hallucination brought on by exhaustion, stress-induced episode, some kind of environmental toxin in the warehouse air. All possible, all insufficient. The office was at the end of the corridor, door closed but unlocked. I'd left it that way when I went to do the final warehouse sweep, intending to return and finish the closing paperwork before setting the alarm and heading home. Now that closed door looked like the most important barrier in the world. I walked toward it, each step careful and measured, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. The corridor remained silent except for my footsteps and the background hum of building systems. I reached the office door and grabbed the handle. Locked. That was wrong. I'd left it unlocked. I was certain I'd left it unlocked because I always left it unlocked during closing procedures, had been written up twice for that very habit before I finally broke it last summer. Except I'd just thought about leaving it unlocked, hadn't I? The memory was right there, clear and accessible, but the door was locked. I pulled out my keys with shaking hands, found the office key and fitted it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, and I pushed the door open. The office was exactly as I'd left it. Computer monitor in sleep mode, paperwork scattered across the desk, my coat draped over the back of the chair. Normal, unthreatened, safe. I stepped inside and immediately turned to close and lock the door behind me. That's when I saw it in the window. The office had a large window overlooking the warehouse floor, installed so managers could maintain visual contact with the donation area without leaving the climate-controlled space. The glass was standard commercial grade, nothing special, sealed into the frame with screws visible along the edges. The thing stood on the warehouse floor below, looking up at the window. At me. And as I watched, it moved toward the wall, began to climb, not with hands and feet like any normal creature would, but by simply flowing upward, as if gravity had become negotiable for this particular entity. I stepped back from the window, my rational mind insisting this couldn't be happening, even as my eyes tracked its impossible ascent. It reached the window level and stopped, pressed against the glass from the outside, that approximation of a face filling the entire pane. The crackling breath sound filled the office, though the window remained closed. Then it began to come through, not breaking the glass, not opening any barrier, simply passing through the solid material as if it possessed no more substance than air. First the head, then the shoulders, the torso, the grotesquely bent legs. It oozed through the window like water through cloth, maintaining its rough human shape while defying every physical law I understood. The temperature in the office spiked instantly, climbing from comfortable to sauna hot in the span of a breath. My breath. Because the thing wasn't breathing anymore. It was inside, and now I was the only one drawing air in the small space. It stood between me and the door, hunched and wrong and impossible. I pressed myself against the desk, trapped, my mind racing through options that all ended with the same conclusion. There was nowhere to go. No escape route I could access before that thing closed the distance between us. But it didn't move closer. Instead, it just stood there, watching me with those wrongly placed eyes, head tilted in that same curious gesture I'd seen before. The heat in the room continued to build, sweat now running freely down my face and back, making my shirt cling to my skin in wet patches. And then it spoke. Not with words exactly, more like the impression of words, formed from the sound of that crackling breath and the hum of fluorescent lights, and the white noise of blood rushing through my ears. But the meaning came through clearly enough. I've been here longer than you. The statement hung in the superheated air, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity what it meant. This thing, this presence, had always been in the building. In the walls, maybe, or the spaces between floors, or that dimensional gap where physics breaks down and the impossible becomes merely improbable. How many closing managers had heard that breathing? How many had seen shadows move with no light to cast them? How many had filled out those maintenance requests that disappeared, had mentioned the sounds to colleagues who laughed them off? You leave now, the impression came again, though the thing's mouth-like opening hadn't moved. You leave, and you don't come back. I wanted to argue, to assert my right to this space, to demand explanations and insist on rational order. But the words died in my throat, killed by the heat and the fear, and the absolute certainty that this thing could do more than simply follow me through aisles. It moved aside, or rather, it was suddenly no longer between me and the door, having displaced in that same impossible way. The path was clear. I didn't run. Running felt like it might trigger some predatory response, might transform this thing from observer to actor. Instead, I walked with forced calm to the door, turned the lock, and opened it slowly. The corridor beyond was blessedly cool, and I stepped into it with a relief so profound it nearly buckled my knees. Behind me, I heard that crackling breath one final time. and then nothing. I went through the motions of setting the building alarm, of locking the external doors, of walking to my car in the parking lot. Autopilot carried me through each familiar action, while my conscious mind remained locked in that superheated office, trying to process what had just happened. I called in sick the next 3 days. When I finally returned, I submitted my 2 weeks' notice before my shift even started. The general manager accepted it without question, without asking why, as if she'd been expecting it, as if this was a conversation she'd had before with other closing managers who'd lasted just long enough to notice. On my last night, I made sure to leave while it was still light outside, made sure every door was locked behind me, every light turned on rather than off, and I didn't look back at the building, didn't let myself see if anything watched from the warehouse windows. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment across town, I wake up to a sound I can't quite place, a wet, crackling rhythm that might be my own breathing, or might be something else entirely. And in those moments, I'm not sure if I really left that building or if something followed me home, maintaining distance, matching my movements, waiting in the spaces between sleep and waking where the impossible becomes real and shadows have breath of their own. The heat in my bedroom rises whenever I hear it, and I've learned not to look toward the window. Story 11. The house breathed differently at night. I noticed it the moment I arrived in Cambridge, pulling up to the Victorian rental where my college friend Declan had been living for the past 3 months. The structure itself seemed to lean slightly forward, as if listening to conversations on the street below. Paint peeled from the windowsills in long, deliberate strips, and the front porch sagged in the middle like a concave chest. November wind scraped dead leaves across the steps, and somewhere inside, I could hear water running through old pipes, a sound like whispered conversation just beyond the range of understanding. Declan met me at the door with the kind of enthusiasm that felt slightly forced, his handshake lasting a beat too long. He looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes carrying a permanent exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed capable of fixing. The interior of the house matched its exterior, high ceilings that trapped shadows in their corners, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch longer than they should, and a persistent smell of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and old, like wet leaves left too long in a pile. The guest room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor that grew progressively darker despite the overhead lights. Declan explained that 2 other graduate students occupied the remaining bedrooms, but they were away for the weekend at some academic conference. The isolation in his voice when he mentioned this felt deliberate, as if he'd been waiting all week to not be alone in the house. The room itself was unremarkable at first glance. A double bed with a metal frame, a desk pushed against one wall, a dresser that looked like it had survived several decades of student housing, and a single window that overlooked the back garden. But the temperature was wrong. Despite the radiator clanking and hissing in the corner, the air held a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I could see my breath in small clouds when I spoke, asking Declan about the thermostat. He assured me the heat was on, had been on all day, and suggested I use the extra blankets stacked in the closet. His eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it, and he left quickly, mentioning something about making dinner. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that made the room feel suddenly smaller. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my chest since crossing the threshold. The dresser drawers stuck when I pulled them, releasing small puffs of musty air. Inside one, I found a library card from 1987, the name on it faded to illegibility. In another, a single button made of tarnished silver, small artifacts of previous occupants, forgotten in the corners of temporary spaces. That first night, I slept poorly. The house settled constantly, each creak and groan seeming to follow a pattern I couldn't quite discern. Footsteps that might have been branches against the siding, voices that might have been wind through the eaves, and underneath it all, a low humming that vibrated through the bed frame. So faint I wondered if I was imagining it, if it was just the blood pulsing in my ears. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the strangeness of a new place, the particular architecture of old houses, the heightened awareness that comes from sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. Declan seemed more himself over breakfast, showing me around the neighborhood, introducing me to the coffee shop where he spent most of his time working on his dissertation. We fell into the easy rhythm of old friendship, and I forgot about the cold room, the odd sounds, the sense of being studied by the house itself. But that night, everything changed. I woke at 3:47 a.m. The red digits on the alarm clock burned into my vision when I opened my eyes. The room was darker than it should have been, the streetlight that had filtered through the curtains now completely absent, as if something outside the window had moved into position to block it. The temperature had dropped even further. I could feel frost forming on the inside of my nostrils with each breath, and I wasn't alone. The certainty of it hit me before I could rationalize it away. Something was in the room with me. Not beside the bed or in the corner, but somehow occupying the same space I did, pressing against me from all directions like atmospheric pressure. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed from every angle simultaneously. I forced myself to sit up, reaching for the bedside lamp. The switch clicked once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The bulb had worked fine hours earlier. I fumbled for my phone, but when I pressed the button, the screen remained black. Dead battery. Though I'd charged it fully before bed, in the darkness I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like wood sliding across wood. It came from the direction of the dresser. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out its silhouette against the slightly less dark wall, and as I watched, it moved. Not dramatically, just an inch or two forward, as if pushed by invisible hands. Then another inch. The sound continued, deliberate and measured, the dresser inching across the floor with impossible smoothness. I should have gotten up, should have turned on the overhead light, should have opened the door and called for Declan, should have done anything but sit there frozen, watching the furniture rearrange itself in the dark. But my body wouldn't respond to my brain's increasingly frantic commands. I could only watch as the dresser continued its slow migration, moving steadily toward the door. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, too fast and too loud. Could hear the frost crystallizing on the window. Could hear, impossibly, the house breathing. Long, slow inhalations and exhalations that made the walls expand and contract by fractions of inches. Then the books started. They lifted from the desk one by one, rising into the air with a casual weightlessness that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. They hovered there for a moment, suspended in the darkness, before launching themselves toward the walls. Not falling, launching, with force and intention. Each impact was sharp and precise, the sound of paper and cardboard hitting plaster with velocity. One after another, they flew across the room, and I could do nothing but pull the blankets up to my chest like a child, like they could somehow protect me from whatever was happening. A coffee mug followed, then a pen holder, then the desk lamp, its cord yanking free from the outlet with a snap of electricity. They ricocheted off the walls and ceiling, creating a percussion that should have brought Declan running but somehow didn't. The house swallowed the noise, absorbed it into its old bones, kept the chaos contained to this single room. And through it all, I felt watched, studied. As if something invisible sat in the corner, tilting its head, observing my reactions with clinical interest, testing me, measuring something I couldn't name. The moment I moved, the instant I shifted my weight to get out of bed, everything stopped. The objects hung motionless in midair for one impossible second before dropping straight down, hitting the floor with mundane thuds. The oppressive presence vanished like air rushing out of a vacuum, and the cold intensified, became so severe that my muscles seized, my joints locked, every cell in my body screaming at me to get warm, get out, get away. I stumbled toward the door, my legs barely functioning, my breath coming in ragged gasps that created clouds of vapor so thick I could barely see. My hand closed around the doorknob, and that's when the dresser completed its journey. It slammed into position in front of the door with a sound like a gunshot, the impact shaking the floor beneath my feet. Not sliding now, moving with purpose, with speed, blocking my exit completely. I pulled at the door anyway, desperate, irrational, and it opened perhaps 2 inches before the edge caught on the dresser's corner. Through the gap, I could see a sliver of the hallway, illuminated by the nightlight Declan kept plugged in near the bathroom. Something moved in that light. A shadow that didn't correspond to any object I could identify. It rippled along the wall, growing larger, approaching the door from the outside. I could hear it, a sound like wet fabric dragging across wood, accompanied by that same low humming that had kept me awake the night before, now loud enough to feel in my teeth. I released the doorknob and staggered backward, and the temperature began to rise. Not gradually, all at once, as if someone had opened a furnace door. The frost on the window melted in seconds, running down the glass in streams. The vapor from my breath vanished. My frozen muscles relaxed with an almost painful suddenness. The door, still open those 2 inches, slowly swung shut. I watched it happen, watched the gap narrow until it disappeared completely, the latch clicking with a soft finality. And in that moment, standing in a room that had gone from Arctic to tropical in less than 30 seconds, surrounded by objects scattered across the floor in the precise pattern of violence, I understood something fundamental and terrible. Whatever was in this room, in this house, wanted me to see, wanted me to experience. It had been waiting, patient and purposeful, and I had walked directly into its stage. 3 sharp knocks sounded from the other side of the door. Declan's voice, muffled but concerned, asked if I was okay, mentioned he'd heard noises, wondered if everything was all right. His words felt distant, as if spoken from the end of a very long tunnel, or from a different reality entirely. The instant his voice registered, every object that had been thrown returned to its original position. Books floated up from the floor and settled back onto the desk in perfect order. The lamp reappeared on its stand, cord plugged in, bulb glowing softly. The dresser scraped backward, retracing its path with mechanical precision, until it stood exactly where it had been when I'd first entered the room days ago. By the time I opened the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob, everything looked completely normal. Declan stood in the hallway, his hair mussed from sleep, his eyes heavy with concern. Behind him the house was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. As if I'd imagined the entire episode, I told him I'd had a nightmare. Heard myself speaking the words from somewhere far away. Watched his expression shift from worry to understanding to something else. Something that looked almost like resignation. He asked if I wanted tea. Mentioned that the house could be unsettling at night. Admitted with a nervous laugh that he'd had his own strange experiences since moving in. Nothing specific, he added too quickly. Just the usual old house weirdness. But his eyes told a different story. They held knowledge, recognition, and beneath that, fear. Not of me, but for me. As if he'd watched others go through this same process, had seen this particular play performed before, and knew how the final act would unfold. I didn't sleep again that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat in the desk chair, every light in the room turned on, watching the corners for movement. The house remained quiet, but I could feel it around me like a living thing, aware, attentive, waiting, attentive. The sun rose with painful slowness, each minute stretching like taffy, and when morning finally arrived, I packed my bag with trembling hands. Declan was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, coffee already made, his face carefully neutral. He asked if I was leaving early, and I invented an excuse about work, about responsibilities, about anything that wasn't the truth. He nodded along, not believing a word, and walked me to the door. On the porch, he hesitated, then spoke in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. He mentioned that the room had a history, that previous guests had mentioned unusual experiences, that he probably should have warned me but hadn't wanted to seem crazy. He said the occurrences always stopped after the first incident, that whatever inhabited the space seemed satisfied once it had made its presence known. He asked, without quite asking, if I planned to tell anyone. I looked back at the house, at the second-floor window of the guest room, and saw the curtain move. Not from wind. There was no wind. Just a deliberate shift, as if something inside had stepped away from the glass after watching our entire conversation. I told Declan I wouldn't say anything. Told him I hoped his dissertation went well, that we should stay in touch, that I'd see him around. All the meaningless platitudes people exchange when they know they'll never speak again. The drive home took 4 hours. I spent every minute of it trying to rationalize what had happened, constructing elaborate explanations involving old house acoustics, settling foundations, temperature differentials, stress-induced hallucinations. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of waking dream, a product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But 3 things kept me from fully embracing that comfortable delusion. The library card I'd found in the dresser drawer was in my jacket pocket, though I had no memory of taking it. When I examined it more closely in better light, I could make out the name after all, my own, printed in faded ink beneath a photograph of a younger version of myself, a version I had no memory of being. My phone, which I'd watched die in the darkness, showed a full charge and contained a single video file I hadn't recorded. When I played it, I saw 43 minutes of footage from inside the guest room, shot from an angle that would have required the camera to be floating near the ceiling. It showed me sleeping, then waking, then watching in frozen terror as the room came alive around me. But it also showed something else. A figure standing beside the bed, tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an acute angle, watching me watch the chaos it had created. The video ended exactly when Declan had knocked on the door and the figure turned toward the camera, its face a blur of static, before the screen went black. And every night since, at 3:47 a.m., I wake up cold. The temperature in my apartment drops precisely 15 degrees in the span of 30 seconds. Objects don't move, not yet, but I can feel it in the room with me. Patient, observing, following me home from that house in Cambridge like a passenger I'd unknowingly invited into my car. Sometimes in the peripheral darkness, I see it standing in the corner, waiting. And I understand now what Declan couldn't bring himself to say on that porch. It doesn't stop after the first incident. It never stops. It just moves to a new stage. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the basement workshop buzz on at 3:47 a.m., and I know without checking the clock that it's happening again. The sound travels up through the floorboards of my childhood bedroom, now just my bedroom, a mechanical hum that shouldn't exist in a house where I'm the only living thing for 3 miles in any direction. I lie still beneath the quilts my grandmother made, the ones that smell faintly of cedar and something else I can't name, and I listen. The house settles around me with its familiar groans, old timber contracting in the October cold, the furnace kicking on in the crawlspace, normal sounds. But beneath them, threading through them like smoke through mesh, I hear my name. Neil. Just the end of it. Daniel. The way my grandfather used to say it when I'd wander off mid-task, leaving tools scattered across his workbench, a half-assembled birdhouse or a cabinet door hanging from one hinge. That specific tone of exasperation mixed with something that might have been affection, though he never said as much. The cadence is unmistakable, a falling pitch, slightly nasal, with a catch in the throat that came from 40 years of lucky strikes. I inherited this house 4 months ago. The lawyer's office in Harrisburg smelled like burnt coffee and copy paper, and the woman who handled the estate kept apologizing for the delay, as if I'd been waiting impatiently for my grandfather to die. I hadn't been. I'd barely spoken to him in the last decade, our relationship calcified into birthday cards and the occasional stilted phone call where we talked about weather and nothing else. When the hospice nurse called to tell me he'd passed quietly in his sleep, I felt the same thing I feel now, lying in the dark listening to those lights hum, a vague guilt I can't quite locate the source of. The workshop calls to me in a language I don't want to understand. I throw off the quilts and my feet find the cold hardwood. The hallway stretches longer than it should between my room and the basement door, though I know that's impossible. I've walked this hall 10,000 times. The photographs on the walls watch me pass. My grandparents on their wedding day, impossibly young. My father as a child, squinting in harsh sunlight. Me at 8, gap-toothed and holding a perch my grandfather caught. Everyone in the photos looks like they're waiting for something. The basement door stands open. I didn't leave it that way. The stairs descend into a pale glow, that particular sickly green of old fluorescent tubes. I can smell the workshop before I see it. Machine oil and sawdust and the ghost of cigarette smoke that no amount of airing out has managed to erase. My hand finds the rough wooden rail and I start down, each step creaking under my weight, announcing my arrival to whatever waits below. The workshop spreads out before me in its meticulously organized chaos. My grandfather's tools hang on pegboard walls, each one outlined in black marker so you could see at a glance what was missing. The table saw hunches in the corner like a sleeping animal. The workbench dominates the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of cuts and burns and stains. And on that bench, exactly where I left it 3 days ago, sits the half-finished jewelry box. I'd found the plans in my grandfather's desk drawer, tucked inside a folder labeled with my grandmother's name, Miriam. Detailed sketches in his careful hand, measurements noted in the margins, wood samples stapled to the corners, bird's eye maple for the lid, walnut for the body, brass hinges ordered from a specialty supplier in Philadelphia, the receipt still paper-clipped to the invoice, dated October 1987. My grandmother died in March of that year. He never finished it. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, their ballasts humming that electric hymn. I approach the workbench slowly, though I'm not sure what I'm being careful of. The jewelry box sits there in its incomplete state, the body assembled, the corners mitered perfectly, but the lid unattached, the hinges still in their plastic packet. I pick up the lid and run my fingers along the edge my grandfather routed, feeling where his hands shaped the wood. Behind me, something shifts. I don't turn around. I've learned not to turn around. Instead, I watch the reflection in the dark window above the bench, that black square of glass that shows me the workshop in reverse. There's a figure standing near the stairs, tall, stooped slightly at the shoulders, wearing what might be a flannel shirt. The fluorescent lights don't reach that corner properly, so the shape exists more as an absence than a presence, a man-shaped hole in the dim light. My throat tightens. I set down the lid and force myself to breathe steadily, watching that reflection, waiting for it to move or speak or dissolve into the reasonable explanation I keep trying to find. My therapist in Philadelphia would tell me this is stress, grief manifesting in unusual ways, the mind playing tricks in an empty house where every creak and shadow carries the weight of memory. She'd probably increase my dosage, but the figure in the window doesn't behave like a hallucination. It has patience. It stands there with a stillness that feels intentional, that feels like waiting, and I recognize that quality because I grew up in its presence. My grandfather could stand silent for 20 minutes, watching me struggle with a dovetail joint or a mortise cut, never offering help until I'd exhausted every wrong approach. He called it learning. I called it torture. The shape in the reflection shifts its weight from one foot to the other, and I hear the floorboard creak, the same board that always creaked, 3 steps from the bottom of the stairs, the one he never fixed because he said it was useful to know when someone was coming. I turn around. The corner is empty. The workshop stretches out exactly as it should, tools hanging in their designated spots, dust motes swimming in the fluorescent glare. My heart hammers against my ribs with such force I can feel it in my jaw, in my fingertips. I count to 10, then 20, then give up counting and just stand there breathing in the smell of sawdust and oil. When I look back at the window, the reflection shows only me. I should go upstairs, pour myself a whiskey from the bottle I found in my grandfather's study, get back in bed, wait for dawn. Instead, I find myself reaching for the brass hinges, tearing open the plastic packet. My hands know what to do, even though my grandfather never taught me properly, never got around to that particular lesson. I've watched enough YouTube videos in the past 3 months to fake competence. The work absorbs me the way work always does, pulling my attention into the narrow space between intention and execution, measuring twice, drilling pilot holes, setting the hinges so they're perfectly flush. The wood feels warm under my hands. alive in a way that seems impossible for something dead. I lose track of time in that suspended space where nothing exists, except the task and the tools, and the slow revelation of form from chaos. When I finally attach the lid and test its swing, the motion is perfect. Smooth and silent, the kind of craftsmanship that takes years to develop. Too good for my skill level. I stare at the completed box, at the way the bird's eye maple catches the light, and something cold crawls up my spine. I didn't do this alone. The realization comes slowly, like developing a photograph in chemicals, the image emerging from blank paper. There were moments, just moments, where my hands moved without my conscious direction, where I reached for a tool before I knew I needed it, where the angle of the drill bit adjusted itself in ways I didn't plan. Small things, subtle enough to dismiss. But standing here looking at work I don't quite remember doing, I feel that cold certainty settling in my bones. The lights flicker once, twice. I pick up the jewelry box and hold it to my chest. The wood is warm, warmer than it should be. Upstairs I hear footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured steps. The gait of an old man who's lived in this house for 60 years and knows every board, every nail. The steps pause outside my bedroom door, then continue toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. I hear water running in the sink. My grandfather always washed his hands after working in the shop. The ritual of it, soap and hot water, scrubbing under his nails, drying with the green towel he kept hung on the bathroom door. I can picture him doing it now. See him in my mind's eye as clearly as if I were standing beside him. The water shuts off. I climb the stairs holding the finished jewelry box, my legs moving mechanically, each step taking me closer to something I'm not sure I want to confirm. The basement door closes behind me with a soft click, and I stand in the hallway listening to the house breathe. The bathroom is dark, the door half open the way I left it this morning. No one is there. No wet towel, no water droplets in the sink. But I can smell soap. Irish Spring, the same brand my grandfather used. I carry the box to my bedroom and set it on the dresser, then climb back into bed fully clothed. The quilts settle over me like earth. I lie there watching the dark rectangle of the doorway, that portal to the hallway where anything might appear, and I think about unfinished projects. All the things my grandfather left incomplete. The jewelry box for a wife he lost too soon. The deck he'd planned to build off the back of the house. The relationship with a grandson who moved to the city and stopped visiting. The fluorescent lights buzz on again, and this time I don't go down. Neil. My name drifts up through the floorboards. That familiar cadence, that tone of patient exasperation. There's work to be done. There's always work to be done. I close my eyes and try to convince myself I'm imagining it, that grief and isolation have finally broken something in my head that used to be whole. But in the morning, I find sawdust under my fingernails. The days blur together after that. I tell myself I should leave, drive back to Philadelphia, put the house on the market, let someone else deal with whatever haunts this place. But I don't. Instead, I find myself spending more time in the workshop, going through my grandfather's unfinished projects. There are dozens of them, drawers full of half-built things, shelves lined with wood cut to mysterious dimensions, folders stuffed with plans he never executed. I start finishing them. It feels like obligation at first, like I'm cleaning up after him the way I used to clean up my own messes when I was a child, putting tools back in their designated spots, sweeping sawdust into neat piles. But something shifts as the work continues. My hands grow more confident. The projects come together with an ease that frightens me. I build the small bookshelf he'd sketched for the living room. I assemble the wooden puzzle box he'd designed but never constructed. I finish the picture frames, the corbels, the inlaid cutting board. Each completion feels like checking off an invisible list, satisfying some requirement I can't articulate. And every night, the lights turn on by themselves. Every night, I hear my name. Sometimes I see him in reflections, in the window, in the chrome of the table saw, in the glass front of the tool cabinet. Always at the edge of my vision, always watching, never quite substantial enough to confront directly. I've stopped trying to catch him, stopped turning around. It's easier to pretend I don't notice, to act as if we're simply sharing the space the way we used to when I was young and summers stretched forever. The workshop has become a collaboration. I don't sleep much anymore. The distinction between night and day loses meaning when you spend most of your time in a basement under fluorescent lights. I eat when I remember to, showering occasionally, letting my beard grow in. The mirror in the bathroom shows me a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, covered in sawdust. I look like my grandfather did toward the end, when the cancer was eating him from the inside and he'd given up pretending to care. One night, or maybe it's day, I've lost track, I find a final folder in the back of his desk drawer. It's thicker than the others, the edges worn from handling. Inside are plans for a grandfather clock, not a kit, not something simplified for hobbyists. A full-scale project that would take months to complete properly. The kind of work that requires precision and patience and skill I don't possess. The wood is already cut, I discover, stored in the far corner of the workshop, wrapped in canvas, protected from moisture and warping. Cherry and maple aged perfectly, probably purchased decades ago, waiting. I spread the plans across the workbench and study them, tracing the elegant curves with my finger, trying to understand what I'm looking at. The clock face is to be custom-made, etched brass with Roman numerals. The pendulum mechanism is intricate, requiring careful calibration. The case is a masterpiece of joinery, dozens of complex angles and joints that need to align perfectly. It's impossible. I could never build this, not alone. Behind me, I hear the scrape of a stool being pulled across concrete. I don't turn around, but I feel the presence settle there, just over my shoulder, looking at the plans with me. The workshop smells strongly of cigarette smoke now, sharp and immediate, as if someone just lit up. A voice, barely audible, more felt than heard. Start with the bass. My hands move before my mind can object, reaching for the pieces of cherry wood, arranging them on the workbench according to the plans. The joints need to be cut precisely, angles that would take me days to figure out through trial and error. But when I pick up the pieces, I can feel where they want to go. I can sense the shape waiting inside the raw material. I work through what must be the night, losing myself in the rhythm of it. Cut, sand, fit, adjust. My grandfather's presence hovers at the edge of awareness, a weight in the air, a warmth at my back. Sometimes I feel pressure on my hands, gentle guidance, correcting my grip or adjusting an angle. Sometimes I hear that voice again, offering instructions I don't consciously register, but my body somehow understands. The base takes shape. Perfect. Too perfect. I should be terrified. I should run. But instead I feel something else. Something I haven't felt in years. Purpose. Connection. The sense of being part of something larger than myself. Some continuity that stretches backward and forward through time. Dawn light creeps through the window above the workbench, gray and cold. I set down my tools and step back to examine what I've built. The base of the clock stands solid and true, joints so tight you can barely see the seams. Work I couldn't have done yesterday. Work I still don't quite know how I did. I turn around slowly, deliberately, breaking my own rule. My grandfather sits on his stool near the stairs, exactly where he always sat. He looks solid, real, more present than he's been before. Flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, work pants stained with oil. That expression on his face I remember so well. Not quite approval, but something close. Recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement that the work is being done. We look at each other across the cluttered workshop, across the distance of all those wasted years, and I understand finally what he needs. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just this. The work finished, the projects completed, the things he left undone made whole. I open my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but before I can form words, he fades. Not dramatically, not with any supernatural flourish. He simply becomes less solid, less there, until I'm staring at an empty stool and wondering if he was ever there at all. But the base of the clock stands on the workbench, real and tangible, joints cut with impossible precision. I don't know how long it will take to finish. Weeks, probably. Maybe months. However long it takes, I'll be here, in this workshop, under these humming fluorescent lights, completing what he started, finishing what we never got to finish together. The house is silent now. No footsteps, no running water, no voice calling my name. I pick up the sandpaper and return to the clock, running my hands over the cherry wood, feeling for imperfections. My reflection stares back at me from the window, and I realize with a start that I'm not alone in the image. There's a shadow behind me, indistinct, possibly just a trick of the light, or possibly not. I don't turn around to check. Instead, I keep working, because that's what we do. We finish what we start. We honor what came before. And if it takes a lifetime, if it costs me everything, if I become as much a ghost in this workshop as he is, at least the work will be done. At least something will be complete. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, and somewhere in the house, a clock that doesn't exist yet begins to tick.